In the stillness before dawn, the lake held its breath. Mist hovered like memory over the water, and out of it rose a city that seemed too delicate to be real. Tenochtitlan, the city on the lake, shimmered as though painted on glass. From the distance, its temples and terraces appeared to float, anchored not by stone but by belief. The water mirrored every color of the sky, doubling the world, blurring the boundary between heaven and earth. To the first eyes that saw it, it must have looked like a dream that refused to end. Beneath the reflection lay genius. What began as a cluster of reed huts on marshland had become the heart of an empire that ruled valleys, mountains, and mines. The Aztecs had coaxed order out of chaos, turning swamp into sanctuary. Their engineers built causeways that stretched across the lake like veins, carrying traders, warriors, and whispers from every corner of the realm. Water was both wall and road, protection and invitation. Canals cut through the city like ribbons of light, guiding canoes heavy with cacao, obsidian, and gold. At night, torches drifted upon the water, their flames trembling like living stars. Every street led upward to temples, to gods, to the idea that human hands could reach the divine. The great temple rose above all, twin staircases, ascending to shrines that caught the first fire of sunrise. Priests climbed those steps carrying offerings, believing the world's heartbeat depended on their faith. From afar, the temple was a monument. Up close, it was an altar of necessity. Each stone whispered the same truth: creation demanded payment, and so beauty and blood became partners, inseparable as water and sky. The people of Tenochtitlan lived in rhythms shaped by both reverence and precision. They observed the heavens not to dream, but to measure. Stars dictated seasons, harvests, and wars. Time was not a line but a circle, an endless return of beginnings disguised as ends. Their calendar carved order into eternity, but within that perfection hid anxiety. What if the cycle ever stopped turning? What if the gods who once rose with the sun grew tired of rising? Even the city's brilliance hinted at fragility. Its foundations rested on floating gardens, chinampas, islands of mud and reed, tethered by willpower. Every generation rebuilt what the water tried to reclaim. The lake watched, patient, as men built miracles upon its skin. It gave everything, yet waited for the moment to take it back. Perhaps the Aztecs knew this. Perhaps that is why their architecture reached skyward, as though to bargain with the heavens for one more dawn. The markets pulsed with life. Thousands gathered to trade, to gossip, to marvel. Every voice echoed against stone and water until the city itself seemed to hum. Feathers flashed like jewels, drums rolled like distant thunder, and beneath it all, an unspoken certainty held the people together. They were the chosen keepers of the fifth sun, guardians of a world that had already ended 4 times before. Theirs was the age meant to last, or so they prayed. And yet, beauty has a shadow. The same lake that fed their crops could swallow their temples. The same faith that bound them could blind them. In every perfect reflection, a crack waits to appear. The city glistened not just with light, but with warning a balance too flawless to endure. Perhaps the gods were already whispering through the ripples, reminding men that nothing divine ever stays still for long. When night returned, the water grew dark again, the torches dimmed, and silence returned to the canals. Somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen sails drifted toward the coast, silent, pale, and patient. The lake still mirrored the stars, but its reflection trembled slightly, as if aware that the next dawn would not belong to the same world. Tenochtitlan slept, suspended between water and sky, glory and oblivion. The narrator's voice lowers to a murmur calm, almost tender, as if not to wake the city too soon. Every mirror eventually cracks. And far beyond the mountains, the wind carried the scent of the sea. The sky had always spoken to them. For generations, the Aztecs had read its shifting colors as messages from the gods, gentle when blue, warning when red. But one night, the heavens began to burn. A great tongue of fire split the darkness and lingered there, hanging over the capital for nights on end. It did not move like a comet, nor fade like a shooting star. It simply burned silent, watching, unnatural. The priest said it was Quauhtemoc, the fire serpent, writhing across the firmament to mark the end of an age. People stood in their doorways and whispered prayers that felt hollow even as they left their lips. There were 8 omens recorded in total, each more unsettling than the last. The first was the burning sky. The second, a temple struck by lightning, though the sky was clear. The third, fire erupting from the lake itself, glowing like molten sun. The fourth, an apparition of warriors clashing in the clouds above the horizon. The fifth, voices in the night, crying through the air like wind made human, wailing for something no one could name. The sixth, a strange woman, dressed in white, wandering the streets at dusk, weeping and whispering, "My children, we must leave, we must leave." The seventh omen was the arrival of a mirror, a shimmering disk in the sky where the sun should not have been, reflecting images no one understood. And the eighth, perhaps the most haunting, was the discovery of men with 2 heads and beasts, larger than any the Aztecs had known, visions seen by hunters, dismissed by scholars, yet carved into memory all the same. Whether these omens truly occurred or were remembered through the lens of dread no longer matters. What matters is that they were believed. Belief is its own kind of weapon, invisible, yet it can unmake armies before a single arrow flies. In the palace of Tenochtitlan, Emperor Moctezuma was haunted not by enemies, but by dreams. He would wake in the darkness long before dawn, his hands trembling, the air thick with the scent of burning copal. Servants found him walking the terraces, staring at the horizon as if expecting the sun to refuse its duty. His counselors brought him gifts and prophecies, but none eased the unrest that hollowed his gaze. The emperor who ruled millions began to move like a ghost within his own halls. He ordered the priests to search the codices, the old songs, the sacred calendars, anything that might explain the signs. They came to him with answers wrapped in fear. The gods were displeased. The cycle of the 5th sun, the era of human beings, was drawing to a close. To keep the world alive, greater offerings must be made. Blood, perhaps, was no longer enough. So the city prepared more sacrifices. Hearts beat faster, both on altars and within the chests of those still living. Drums echoed through the nights low, endless, like the pulse of the dying world itself. Yet the omens did not stop. Even the water changed. Fishermen swore the lake's reflection moved before their boats did, that faces appeared beneath the ripples. The priests said the boundary between the realms was thinning. Outside the palace, the people murmured about an ancient prophecy, the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who had once ruled in wisdom before vanishing to the east. He had promised to return one day, when the world was old and the people had forgotten balance. The year of his return, it was said, would fall on Cuauhtemoc one reed, a cycle that had come again. And in that same year, white sails would rise on the eastern horizon. Moctezuma could not ignore the alignment. The omens, the fear, the stars all pointed to the same impossible truth. The gods were returning, but not as friends. His advisors urged him to stay strong, to remind the people that power still flowed through his veins. Yet the emperor's silence deepened. His priests began to whisper among themselves that perhaps even he no longer believed his own divinity. And when a ruler doubts himself, an empire begins to exhale. Each night, the palace filled with light and smoke as priests performed cleansing rituals, sprinkling the walls with blood and chanting to unseen ears. Each morning, the omens returned, patient and precise. A sudden sickness struck the birds that nested along the temple roofs. Their bodies fell into the streets. The water level in the canals dropped overnight, then rose higher than before, drowning gardens. The air itself felt restless, as if waiting for something to arrive. Fear seeped into daily life like moisture into stone. Traders spoke in hushed tones at the markets. Warriors avoided meeting each other's eyes. Mothers warned children not to stare too long at the lake. The city still glittered, still functioned, but its soul had begun to fold inward. When faith begins to shake, even sunlight looks uncertain. Moctezuma's dreams grew stranger. He saw towers collapsing into mist, serpents swallowing suns, a world drowning not in water but in silence. He asked the magicians if the visions were warnings or memories. None could answer. One night, he dreamt of a man in shining armor walking across the lake as if it were solid ground. When he awoke, his body felt heavier, as though part of him already knew the dream had been true. The empire's defenses, its warriors, its wealth, its vast alliances remained intact. Yet none of it mattered. for the heart of the civilization had already begun to surrender. No sword could cut as deeply as prophecy. No arrow could pierce as cleanly as belief. Before a single foreign step had touched Aztec soil, the idea of defeat had already taken root. The priests continued their sacrifices, but each offering seemed to buy less time. The gods did not answer. Even the fires on the temple tops burned lower, as though embarrassed to be seen. The calendar stone turned, but its carvings felt like echoes of something that had already ended. When dawn came, it did so without promise. On one of those restless mornings, the emperor stood at his balcony, watching the mist shift over the lake. He saw shapes in it, sails, wings, perhaps just tricks of tired eyes. But something in his chest told him the omens had finished their work. The gods had spoken. Now men would come to carry out their will. He turned away, but the reflection in the water below stayed watching him still, unwavering, almost alive. The night before the strangers landed, the city lay under a full moon. The drums fell silent for the first time in memory. The people did not sleep, they simply waited. In the distance, the surf murmured like a secret being rehearsed. The air smelled of salt, unfamiliar and heavy. And as dawn approached, the narrator's voice softens, carrying the weight of centuries. The empire had already fallen long before the first step touched its shore. It fell in dreams, in omens, in the quiet places where faith turns to fear. The sound of waves grows louder, cresting into the calm. And then the strangers came ashore. The sea was quiet when they came ashore. Not peaceful, just silent, as if holding its breath. The sand beneath their boots was pale and endless, the air heavy with salt and omen. Behind them, the ocean shimmered like a curtain between worlds. Ahead, a continent waited, vast and green, veiled in mist and myth. Hernán Cortés stood at the edge of it, his armor tarnished, his face carved by exhaustion and something more dangerous conviction. They were barely 500 in number, mercenaries, fugitives, dreamers and believers. Some had fought in wars that ended without glory. Others had chased fortunes that never existed. A few simply followed the man who seemed to know where destiny lived. Their clothes clung damp against sunburned skin. Their weapons, dull from salt air, were held as if by habit rather than hope. They had crossed an ocean not for faith or nation, but for the promise of gold, the kind of gold men believed could erase the past. Cortés moved among them like a priest among sinners. His words were steady, almost tender, as he told them what they already knew but feared to hear. There would be no turning back. The ships that had carried them across the sea now waited in the harbour like ghosts of indecision. They creaked against their moorings, whispering of escape. The men glanced toward them, calculating. Some whispered of mutiny. Others stared at the jungle ahead, where the unknown seemed to breathe. That night, by torchlight, Cortés gathered his captains. The flicker of flame danced across their faces, hollowing eyes, gilding sweat into false halos. He spoke softly, so softly that they leaned closer to hear. "The path forward is life," he said. "The path back is death." His hand trembled only once when he made the sign of the cross before giving the order. Then, with no ceremony, the men went down to the shore and set their own salvation on fire. Flames rose high against the wind, bright as confession. The ships groaned as timbers split and sails curled into ash. The sea turned orange, swallowing the light as if feeding on their hesitation. Some men watched in silence, others cursed aloud. A few wept quietly, ashamed of it. They knew what it meant. The sea that had carried them here would carry no one home. The smoke drifted inland, winding between trees like a new kind of omen. For hours, they stood watching until nothing remained but black ribs jutting from the tide. It was not courage that kept them still, but disbelief that a man would truly burn the only bridge between himself and safety. Yet in that destruction, Cortés found power. He had made retreat impossible, and in doing so, turned despair into devotion. His men might have hated him, but they would now die for him. It is an old truth of conquest. Faith grows strongest when it has nowhere else to go. As dawn broke, the smell of charred wood mixed with the scent of the jungle sweet, damp, alive. Parrots screamed overhead like mocking spirits. The soldiers packed their meagre supplies, tightened their belts, and began to march inland. Each carried his burden differently. Some prayed, others laughed to hide their shaking. A few touched the soil with reverence, as though stepping onto the skin of destiny itself. The land rose and fell before them, like the body of a sleeping giant. Rivers wound through forests thick as cathedrals. Strange flowers opened where their boots fell. Every step felt like trespass. They followed the native guides who walked in silence, eyes lowered, faces unreadable. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the guides said, lay a kingdom of gold and temples, a city so vast that even the gods might envy it. The Spaniards listened, pretending not to believe, yet dreaming in secret. Cortés walked ahead, not speaking, his thoughts a private storm. He was not merely chasing wealth, he was chasing proof. Proof that the world could still be remade by will alone. That men, through belief and audacity, could seize fate from the hands of heaven. He had burned his ships, not only to bind his men, but to bind himself. He had cut away the past, so that only one path remained, forward, through faith or ruin. The march consumed days. They met villages wary but curious, offering food, water, and warnings. Word spread of men with iron faces and thunder in their hands. The people bowed, traded, and vanished into trees, as if unsure whether they were greeting gods or doom. Every night the Spaniards camped under stars that seemed too close, their fires tiny replicas of the ships they had destroyed. In the darkness, the jungle pulsed with invisible life. Insects sang, drums echoed faintly from unseen distances. The men tried to sleep, but the air was thick with both wonder and dread. Some began to dream of home, but home no longer existed. In their minds, the burning ship still floated, forever aflame, a reminder that return was a myth. Others dreamed of gold, rivers lined with it, temples built from it, crowns heavy with it. Greed and fear became twin lodestars, pulling them forward with equal force. They followed Cortés, not out of loyalty, but because he walked as though guided by something beyond human sight. In the rare, quiet moments, he spoke to his scribe, describing what they saw in words that trembled between awe and ambition. The land is endless, he said, and the people speak of gods who walk among them. Perhaps we will meet them. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that could mean belief or blasphemy. His eyes, though, were unblinking, like a man who had already seen the end of the story and accepted it. By the time they reached the inland plains, their boots were torn, their bodies thin, but their eyes burned with something new, a hunger that no food could touch. They had crossed from fear into fever, from men into instruments of destiny. Whether they would live or die no longer mattered. The only sin now was to turn back. Behind them, the sea exhaled smoke, and the last black skeleton of a ship sank beneath the waves. Ahead, the horizon shimmered faintly, as if mirroring the glow of some unseen city. The men did not yet know its name, but the wind seemed to whisper it anyway, soft, distant, inevitable. Tenochtitlan. As the ashes drifted inland, the jungle seemed to lean closer, listening, and in that silence between waves and wind, history took its first breath of fire. They met on a shore where two worlds tried to speak, and neither truly could. The wind carried the scent of salt and earth, of newness and dread. The emissaries came barefoot, their garments woven with jade and feathers that shimmered like living flame. They bowed low, their gestures precise, rehearsed from centuries of ritual meant to greet gods, not men. The Spaniards watched in silence, armor catching the sun, eyes unreadable beneath their helmets. Somewhere in that stillness, history exhaled and began to misunderstand itself. The emissaries spoke first. Their language was music, measured tones, rising and falling like waves. The words meant reverence, welcome, tribute. The Spaniards heard the rhythm, but not the meaning. They saw gifts being laid at their feet, necklaces of gold shaped like suns, masks studded with turquoise, cloth so fine it seemed woven from air. The Aztecs offered them as signs of respect. The Spaniards accepted them as surrender. Gold glinted on Cortés's palm, and something hardened in his face. To him, these men were not emissaries of an empire, but couriers of weakness. "Look," he said softly to his captains, "they give us what they worship." He turned the necklace in his hand, as if testing the weight of fate itself. The emissaries mistook his silence for divine restraint. They bowed again, relieved, believing peace had been secured through humility. Neither side realized that peace had already become impossible. Among the Spaniards stood a woman young, quiet, her eyes sharp with an intelligence no one else possessed. Her name was Malinali, though they would call her Doña Marina, and later simply La Malinche. Born of noble blood, sold into slavery, she had survived by listening. Now she stood between two languages, translating words that were not meant to meet. To the Spaniards she was a gift, to her own people an echo of betrayal. Yet she spoke clearly, each sentence building a fragile bridge over an abyss of misunderstanding. When Cortés spoke, his words passed through two translators, first through Jerónimo de Aguilar, a shipwrecked Spaniard fluent in Maya, then through Malinche, who knew both Maya and Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. By the time his message reached Moctezuma's emissaries, it was something entirely new, neither truth nor lie, but a creation of necessity. Through her voice, conquest found its first breath. The emissaries told Cortés of their great emperor, Moctezuma, ruler of the Valley of Mexico. They said he had heard of the strangers with thunder weapons and iron skin, and that he welcomed them as honored guests. His gifts were meant to show friendship, but also to persuade them to leave. Cortés smiled. He heard invitation, not warning. He asked to meet this emperor. The emissaries hesitated. The gods they had been told to fear were now asking for audience. Malinche watched them, her mind moving faster than her tongue. She saw the fear in their eyes, the reverence, the confusion. She translated the words, but she could not translate the silence between them. And it was in that silence that fate began to twist. Cortés thanked them and returned their courtesy with gifts of his own glass beads, mirrors, and trinkets that sparkled like stars. The Aztecs accepted them with awe, not realizing these objects held no value to their givers. To the Spaniards, the exchange confirmed superiority. To the Aztecs, it confirmed prophecy. They believed Quetzalcoatl, the god who had promised to return from the east, had arrived wearing metal and light. The world was unfolding exactly as their priests had warned, and yet no one dared to name it aloud. That night, as fires flickered along the beach, the two camps watched each other from a distance. The Spaniards whispered about the gold, how easily it was given, how much more might wait inland. The emissaries spoke in low voices about the strangers, their pale faces, their bearded mouths, their beasts with eyes of fire. Each side believed it understood the other. Each was wrong. Malinche sat apart, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She had no illusions about the men she served. She had heard them speak of conquest in words they thought she could not fully grasp. She knew that to them, the world ahead was not sacred, it was opportunity. But she also knew she could not go back. Her voice had become her survival, and survival had become her curse. Every word she spoke reshaped the path before them, like stones laid across a river that could never again run clear. In the morning, the emissaries departed, promising to carry Cortés's message to Moctezuma. They left offerings of food and flowers along the path, gestures of courtesy that the Spaniards mistook for tribute. When the last canoe disappeared into the mist, Cortés turned to his men and said, "The Empire knows we have come." His tone carried neither triumph nor doubt, only inevitability. The jungle around them seemed to listen. Birds fell silent. Even the waves retreated, as though unwilling to carry sound back to the sea. The men began preparing for the inland march, their armor creaking, their minds already haunted by rumors of cities paved with gold. Malinche stood beside Cortés, translating orders, her voice calm, her eyes far away. She understood what he did, not that no meeting of worlds begins cleanly. Every word exchanged that day would echo through centuries like a wound that refused to close. When the emissaries reached Tenochtitlan, they told their emperor what they had seen. Men of iron, beasts that breathed smoke, a leader who spoke through a woman and demanded audience. Moctezuma listened in silence, his hands clasped, his face pale beneath the weight of prophecy. The omens had spoken, and now the messengers confirmed them. He ordered more gifts, sent more gold, more feathers, more pleas disguised as honors. Perhaps generosity could dissuade the inevitable. But generosity was its own kind of language, and it too was mistranslated. To the Aztecs, giving meant power. Only the strong could afford to give. To the Spaniards, receiving meant dominance. Only the weak paid tribute. In that misunderstanding, conquest found its logic. Days later, Cortés's men began their march inland, following the path the emissaries had taken. The gifts of gold glimmered in the sunlight as they carried them not as symbols of peace, but as promises of more. The road ahead wound through jungle and dust, through alliances and betrayals waiting to happen. Behind them, the ocean sighed against the shore, carrying with it the ashes of the burned ships. Before them, unseen beyond mountains, the Valley of Mexico waited vast, glittering, sacred. And as the camera of history pulls back, the narrator's voice falls to a whisper. They followed the road of gifts, straight into the heart of a god. In the palace at the heart of Tenochtitlan, where incense thickened the air and the walls shimmered with jade, the emperor sat alone. Moctezuma, speaker of the gods and master of millions, gazed into a mirror made of polished obsidian. It was no ordinary mirror. To him, it was a doorway, a surface through which truth might appear if one's spirit were strong enough to look without fear. But as he peered into its dark heart, the mirror no longer reflected his face. It showed instead shifting clouds, burning ships, and men who walked like gods yet spoke like strangers. Each night, the same visions returned. Each morning, they left behind silence and unease. He had once been certain of everything, of the calendar's rhythm, of the gods' desires, of his own voice as their vessel. But now, the patterns had unravelled. The omens that once seemed distant had crept into the palace itself. The mirror whispered with images that refused to obey him. Moctezuma's priests called it divine revelation, but he feared it was madness. He wondered whether the mirror still obeyed the gods, or whether something else had begun to speak through it. He had been told since childhood that the gods return in cycles, that the world itself is a wheel of beginnings disguised as endings. Yet this time, the turning felt final. Each report from the coast, pale-skinned men with thunder in their hands, beasts that could devour distance, banners marked with unknown crosses made his pulse quicken. The old prophecies said that Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, would return from the east in the year one reed, bringing with him renewal or destruction. And this was that year. Moctezuma prayed for clarity, but the gods answered only in echoes. He sought counsel from his priests, from his astrologers, from his generals. All spoke in riddles, each afraid to name what all suspected. One priest declared that the strangers were divine envoys, proof of prophecy fulfilled. Another argued they were demons sent to test devotion. The emperor listened, his expression unreadable. In his silence, belief and fear braided into one. To act rashly might anger the gods, to do nothing might doom the world. He had built his empire upon certainty, the kind that leaves no room for doubt. Yet now doubt was the only thing that felt alive. It moved in his veins like fever. At night, when the torches burned low and the temple drums ceased, he walked the terraces alone. From that height, he could see the city stretch across the lake, thousands of torches flickering on the water like captive stars. It should have comforted him, this vision of perfection. Instead, it made him feel small. He imagined the city as a mirror, fragile and bright, floating between heaven and earth, waiting for one wrong breath to shatter it. Sometimes he spoke to the obsidian mirror as if it were a companion. He asked it simple questions. Are they gods? Are they men? But the surface offered only shapes, fire, sails, faces he did not know. Once, he thought he saw his own reflection twist and become another's, a man wearing iron, eyes like coals, a mouth that smiled without warmth. The image faded, but its presence remained, lingering like smoke. He could not name it, but deep inside, something in him whispered the name Cortés. In council meetings, he hid his unease behind ritual calm. When messengers described the strangers' strange weapons, their thundering rods that spat death and smoke, he nodded thoughtfully, as though listening to poetry rather than prophecy. Yet his hands trembled beneath the table. When the priests reminded him that gods often tested mortals through disguise, his heart faltered. If these were gods, could war against them be anything but blasphemy? Days became sleepless nights. Servants began to whisper that their emperor had stopped eating, that his eyes were rimmed with shadow. He spent hours gazing eastward from his balcony, where the lake met the horizon, as if waiting for something to rise out of it. Every dawn that broke without revelation felt like betrayal. Every sunset deepened his certainty that the gods had already chosen their course and had not chosen him. In the quietest hours, he imagined two futures. In one, he welcomed the strangers as divine and was spared divine wrath. In the other, he defied them and risk destroying all he had built. Between these futures lay paralysis, a stillness so heavy that even the city seemed to sense it. The markets grew quieter, the priests burned more incense, the people began to dream of storms. When the next emissaries returned from the coast bearing new gifts and new tales, Moctezuma held the offerings in his hands. Gold, jewels, words of greeting wrapped in fear. The emperor studied each token, wondering what kind of god accepts what it already owns. He wanted to believe this was diplomacy, but in his heart he knew it was pleading. Still, he sent more gifts. To buy time, to test the divine, to hope. One night, unable to bear the silence, he sought the high priest, an old man whose eyes were clouded like the mirror's surface. "Tell me," Moctezuma asked, "if the god returns in the form of man, how will I know him?" The priest bowed low. "You will know, great speaker, because no man could doubt what stands before him." Moctezuma turned away, the faintest smile touching his lips. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "the gods are crueler than we imagined." The next morning, he gathered his court and ordered that temples be purified, that sacrifices increase, that every prayer be directed toward the eastern horizon. The lake shimmered under the sun, and a single thought circled his mind like a vulture. If he is divine, let him see our devotion. If he is mortal, let the gods decide what follows. The empire held its breath with him. Messengers came and went, their reports growing stranger. The strangers had allied with rivals, taken tribute, spoken of peace. Moctezuma listened to every word, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the messenger's shoulder. It was as if he were already speaking to someone unseen, someone approaching, someone inevitable. That night, he stood again before the mirror. His reflection wavered in the obsidian, two faces overlapping, one crowned with feathers, the other glinting with metal. He reached out, his fingertips brushing the cold surface. "If you are God," he whispered, "take what is yours." The mirror gave no answer, only the faint shimmer of torchlight where his face should have been. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant mountains, though no storm had been forecast by the priests. The sound lingered, hollow and slow, like drums calling from far away. Moctezuma closed his eyes. The decision had already been made, though he did not yet know it. The narrator's voice softens to a murmur, like prayer over still water. And so, the emperor opened his gates to the storm. The road to Tenochtitlan wound through valleys that glowed with light. The Spaniards had seen cities before, stone fortresses, marble cathedrals, ports teeming with noise, but nothing like this. As they crossed the final ridge and saw it at last, they stopped in their tracks. Before them lay a city that seemed to float upon glass. Sunlight spilled across the lake, turning the water into molten gold, and from that gold rose towers and temples as white as bone. Causeways stretched outward like arms, beckoning. The city shimmered with impossible symmetry, as if the gods themselves had drawn its map. For a moment, even Cortés forgot to speak. They advanced slowly, their armor gleaming, their banners snapping in the soft wind. On either side, crowds gathered silent, watchful, thousands deep. Some carried flowers, others incense, their eyes lowered not in submission but in ritual. The scent of burning copal filled the air, sweet and dense, mingling with the tang of salt. When the first petals touched the soldiers' boots, the Spaniards thought it a blessing. They did not see that the flowers were marigolds, blooms of death, meant for the passage between worlds. Canoes glided alongside them in the canals, filled with offerings, fruit, woven cloth, and ornaments of gold that flashed like sunlight trapped in human hands. The water was so clear it reflected every face, Spaniard and Aztec alike, as if the lake itself wished to remember this meeting. Yet beneath that reflection, the shadows shifted. Fish darted through the depths like secrets. The oars moved without sound. Every gesture of welcome felt rehearsed, measured to hide its cost. When they reached the great causeway, Moctezuma awaited them. He was carried on a litter draped in feathers, his crown glittering with jade. Around him walked priests and nobles, their garments heavy with gold. He descended slowly, each step deliberate, as though the earth itself required permission to bear his weight. Cortés stepped forward, removing his helmet in gesture of respect or conquest, depending on who watched. For a heartbeat, the two men stood before one another, the emperor and the conqueror, both certain that destiny had brought them here, both wondering which of them was the dream. The translators spoke Malinche's voice, weaving between them like thread pulled too tight. Her words tried to bridge two worlds that refused to meet. Moctezuma welcomed the strangers as honored guests, the children of a god returned. Cortes bowed and offered gifts, though his eyes lingered on the gold like a man who had just seen proof of paradise. The emperor's smile did not reach his eyes. As they entered the city, the streets opened before them in silent procession. The canals shimmered between rows of white stone houses, bridges arched like ribs over still water. Gardens floated on rafts of soil, heavy with flowers that spilled over the edges like perfume made visible. At every corner, statues watched them pass, gods of rain, of corn, of death, their faces unreadable in the afternoon light. The Spaniards whispered among themselves that no mortal could have built such perfection. Cortes, hearing them, only nodded. He too felt the weight of something divine, but whether it was blessing or warning, he could not tell. The Aztecs led them through the market square, vast as a battlefield. Tens of thousands moved in quiet rhythm, traders, arranging fruit and pottery, scribes painting records on bark, priests counting shells used as currency. It was not chaos, but choreography, a living organism that pulsed with order. The Spaniards had never seen such abundance. To them, it was proof of empire ripe for the taking. To the Aztecs, it was proof that balance still held for now. As the procession continued, the sunlight began to shift. Shadows lengthened across the canals, turning gold to blood. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of flowers now wilting in the heat. The Spaniards smiled, waving to the crowds. The people smiled back, but their eyes stayed cold. Every cheer carried the faint tremor of restraint. Beneath the music and motion, something darker moved, a silence too deep to name. They reached the temple district, where pyramids rose like mountains of carved light. Moctezuma guided Cortes to the foot of the great temple, its twin staircases spiraling upward into the sky. He gestured toward the summit, where the altars waited, still dark from the morning sacrifices. "This," the emperor said through the translator, "is where the gods see our devotion." Cortes inclined his head, his face unreadable. He did not look at the stains. He looked at the stone, the height, the view, the power. The emperor led them to a palace prepared for their stay. Its courtyards shimmered with fountains, its walls gleamed with polished shells and mosaics. The Spaniards marveled at the gifts laid out for them: gold chalices, embroidered robes, fruits from distant provinces. It felt like a dream crafted to flatter them. But dreams, Cortes knew, always had endings. That night, while the guests feasted, the city outside went still. The drums ceased. The laughter faded. Across the lake, torchlight rippled in the distance, moving like signals between unseen watchers. In the banquet hall, Cortes raised his cup and smiled at his host. Moctezuma smiled back. Between them, the translator's voice wove another layer of illusion. Each man believed he was the one in control. Yet both could feel it, the tension beneath the surface, the quiet hum of inevitability. The air carried it, thick and metallic, like the scent before lightning strikes. In every gesture of friendship lay a calculation. The Spaniards studied the layout of the palace, the guards, the exits. The Aztecs studied their weapons, their discipline, their arrogance. Courtesy was camouflage, and both sides wore it well. As midnight approached, Moctezuma retired to his chamber. He removed his crown and stared out across the city. The lake reflected thousands of fires burning in the night, each one a fragment of the empire's heart. From this height, it looked eternal. From this height, it also looked breakable. He whispered a prayer to the gods, not for victory, but for understanding. Elsewhere in the palace, Cortes wrote by candlelight, his quill scratching against parchment. His words were measured, factual, almost cold. The city is the greatest thing ever built by man. But in the margin, where no one else would read, he wrote a single line more. They have welcomed us too easily. Outside, the water lapped quietly against the palace walls, rhythmic as breathing. The gates of Tenochtitlan stood closed, the causeways guarded by soldiers who did not sleep. The strangers were inside. The city, luminous and still, held them like a jewel in its palm. And as the narrator's voice lowers to a whisper, The camera drifts upward through layers of mist and moonlight. The gates close behind the invaders. Trapped within paradise, the storm waited to begin. Before dawn, when the city still slept, the temple priests began their climb. Their bare feet pressed into cold stone, their breaths slow and measured, as if each step was an offering in itself. From the summit, the world unfurled in silence, the lake a dark mirror, the mountains ringed with ghostly mist. The priests turned east, waiting for the first sliver of sun to break the horizon. When it did, drums began to beat low, steady, like the heartbeat of something immense beneath the earth. To the Aztecs, this was not ceremony, it was maintenance. The world survived only through payment, and the currency was life. Every dawn was a transaction between men and gods, a negotiation that had to be renewed before the light could truly return. Without it, the sun would fail, the crops would die, and the fifth age, the age of men, would collapse into darkness forever. In this belief, there was both terror and order. The gods were not merciful but predictable, and that was their mercy. They demanded blood because creation itself had been born from sacrifice. The sun, they said, was once a god who threw himself into the fire to light the sky. Since that first blaze, the balance had been kept through imitation. Every heart offered, every drop of blood spilled, was a continuation of that original gift. Without it, the world would stop breathing. As the drums deepened, the temple square filled. Citizens came not out of cruelty, but reverence. Mothers held their children on their shoulders, so they might witness devotion made visible. The air smelled of copal, sweat, and anticipation. Above them, the priests moved with ritual precision. They were not executioners, they were gardeners tending to the roots of existence. The victims were warriors captured in battle, chosen not for punishment but for honor. To die beneath the obsidian knife was to become immortal, to join the sun in its endless journey across the sky. The ceremony unfolded with dreadful beauty. The priests raised their arms toward the rising light, their chants swelling in rhythm with the drums. Then came the motions swift, exact, centuries rehearsed. The chest opened, the heart lifted high, still pulsing against the morning sun. A single drop fell to the stone and vanished, absorbed by history. The crowd did not cheer. They bowed their heads. The sacrifice was not spectacle, it was survival. The narrator's voice slows, reverent and cold. This was how the empire endured through blood converted into balance. Every city conquered, every tribute collected, every war waged was in service to the same cosmic debt. Expansion was not greed but duty, a holy arithmetic to keep the universe from collapsing under its own indifference. To modernize, it is horror. To theirs, it was harmony. In Tenochtitlan, art and death shared the same vocabulary. The temples were painted in red and white blood and bone, life and purity. Carvings depicted serpents devouring suns, hearts blooming into flowers, skulls sprouting new life from their jaws. The gods themselves were not distant abstractions but living metaphors of duality. Cuauhtemoc, mother of creation, wore a skirt of serpents and a necklace of hearts. Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun, demanded constant nourishment to keep darkness from swallowing the world. Even Totec, the flayed god of renewal, taught that life could be reborn only through the shedding of skin. To live within such a world was to exist in rhythm with contradiction. The same hands that planted maize might one day hold a sacrificial blade. The same songs that welcomed spring might echo through the temple as prayers for rain mixed with the scent of blood. Yet beneath the violence lay coherence. Every act, no matter how brutal, pointed toward continuity, the eternal struggle between creation and decay. Moctezuma himself performed the rites with trembling devotion. In private, he confessed to his priests that the gods had grown hungrier, that the omens meant they were displeased. More sacrifices were ordered not out of tyranny, but fear. The emperor was a servant of forces larger than himself. He ruled not through cruelty, but through the impossible task of keeping the cosmos upright. Each morning, when the sun rose, it was proof that he had succeeded for one more day. Each evening, as it dipped beneath the lake, he wondered if that day had been the last. The Spaniards, when they first heard the drums and saw the processions winding through the temples, mistook what they saw for barbarity. They did not understand that they were witnessing theology, not chaos, a contract written in blood rather than scripture. To them, the altars reeked of hell. To the Aztecs, they shimmered with necessity. Neither side could imagine that both were praying to the same silence, only in different tongues. As the day faded, the priests washed the stones clean, their hands gentle, almost tender. The blood ran down the temple steps, mingling with rainwater, pooling into the canals below. There it dispersed into the lake, the same lake that reflected the city's beauty by day and its dread by night. The water glimmered red for a moment, then turned clear again, as if nothing had happened. Children went to sleep believing they had helped keep the world alive. The priests laid their tools aside and looked westward, where the sun sank behind the mountains. The drums slowed, became heartbeat, then silence. The wind moved through the reeds, carrying the scent of iron and incense alike. The narrator's voice lingers, half whisper, half prayer. They believed that what was taken would one day be returned. But what if the gods we feed never intended to give back? In that question lies the empire's secret sorrow, faith as devotion and doom. For all their grandeur, the Aztecs had built their eternity on an assumption that the gods required them. They did not yet know that another faith, equally hungry, had crossed the sea, a faith that demanded no offerings of blood, yet would take entire worlds in its name. As twilight deepens, the temple fires fade. The last drumbeat dissolves into the night air, replaced by a distant hum, strange, unfamiliar, carried on the wind from the east. It is softer than thunder, steadier than storm. The narrator's tone darkens, like a shadow sliding across the sun. The drums fade under the hum of foreign prayer. The cross arrives. At first, it seemed a simple gesture. A cross of wood, roughly cut, raised in the courtyard beside the temple. The Spaniards gathered around it, their helmets removed, their heads bowed. They sang softly, their words alien but their tone familiar, a rhythm of devotion that pulsed like heartbeat through the morning air. To them, it was a declaration of faith. To the Aztecs, it was a disturbance in the order of heaven. Two kinds of holiness stood side by side, neither willing to kneel. Cortés watched in silence as his men planted the cross firmly into the earth, its shadow falling across the carved face of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. The Spaniards whispered prayers in Latin, tracing the sign of the cross upon their chests. The Aztec priests watched from the steps above, their faces painted, their eyes unreadable. Smoke from incense and torches mingled, spiraling upward until it seemed the sky itself could not decide which offering to accept. The narrator's voice slows, calm but heavy. Conquest does not begin with fire. It begins with symbols. The knife and the cross are both instruments of faith, one meant to feed the divine, the other to forgive, yet both draw blood. The Spaniards had come not only for gold but for souls. To them, the idols of the Aztecs were demons carved into stone, mouths forever open in hunger. Cortés had been instructed by his chaplain, Father Olmedo, that salvation could not share ground with sacrifice. The city must be cleansed not of people, but of gods. And so, while gifts and courtesies continued by day, plans of sanctification unfolded by night. Inside the palace gifted to the Spaniards, the flicker of candlelight stretched across walls once painted with serpents and suns. The priests argued in hushed voices. Some advised patience, that conversion should come through persuasion, not force. Others urged immediate purification, warning that coexistence was an illusion. Cortés listened, saying little. He had seen too much of empire to believe peace could be built on compromise. In his eyes, two heavens could not share one sky. The next morning, he summoned Moctezuma. The emperor arrived, surrounded by his high priests, their robes black with soot from ritual fires. Cortés greeted him with courtesy and gestured toward the great temple that dominated the city. Through Malinche's voice, he spoke of a single god, one who did not thirst for blood. He pointed to the cross and the Virgin's image they had brought from Spain, symbols of light and mercy. He asked that the idols be removed and replaced. Moctezuma listened, his expression serene but distant. He replied that every people serves the gods who made them. The Spaniards' god, he said, might rule the seas and the storms, but here, in the heart of the valley, the old gods still breathed. The temples had been raised to them for generations. Their echoes lived in the stones. To remove them would not cleanse the city, it would unmake it. Malinche's voice trembled as she translated, her words carrying both reverence and dread. She knew the distance between belief and blasphemy was shrinking with every sentence. Cortes's jaw tightened. He replied that false gods bring false peace, that the true God demands worship from all nations. The emperor inclined his head, courteous as ever. "Then let your God dwell beside ours," he said. "If he is stronger, we will see it in time." That was the compromise, or the illusion of one. The Spaniards built their small chapel beside the temple, its wooden cross rising like a second tower of faith. For a brief moment, two worlds stood balanced on the same stone. Priests from both sides performed their rituals within earshot of one another, one chanting in Nahuatl, the other in Latin, their voices interlacing in a harmony that was less music than warning. The city watched. Some believed the newcomer's god might indeed be powerful. Others whispered that the sun had already begun to dim. Each sunrise became a test, each sunset a verdict. One evening, Cortés ascended the temple steps himself. The air grew thin with incense and smoke. From that height, the city spread out like a living mosaic, canals shining, torches flickering like stars. He looked at the idols, carved faces streaked with old blood, their eyes blank and eternal. He could not fathom how beauty could serve darkness so willingly. He ordered his men to erect the cross atop the temple, beside the idols, as a sign of conquest both earthly and divine. The Aztec priests protested, their chants turning from prayer to fury. They warned that desecration would anger the gods, that the sun might refuse to rise. But Cortés only gestured toward the horizon, where the sun already burned proof, he said, that heaven favored him. His men raised the cross, its wood creaking against the wind, while below, the people watched in silence. For a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath. The drums stopped. Even the water of the lake lay still. The cross stood upright beside the idols, a wooden wound in a world of stone. The two faiths stared at one another across that narrow space, and in the quiet that followed, something invisible cracked. That night, storms swept across the valley. Lightning flashed over the temple, splitting the sky in white fire. The Aztecs murmured that the gods were angry. The Spaniards prayed louder, convinced their faith was being tested. Both sides felt vindicated. Neither realized that the storm was not divine but human, the first tremor of betrayal gathering beneath the surface. In the days that followed, tension thickened like humidity before rain. The Spaniards spoke of cleansing idols, of spreading the word of Christ. The Aztec priests warned Moctezuma that the strangers would soon demand more than space, they would demand submission. The emperor tried to calm both sides, hosting feasts, exchanging gifts, pretending balance could be restored. But balance is a fragile thing. It lasts only until belief hardens into certainty. At night, the priests lit torches along the temple walls, their chants low and mournful. Across the courtyard, the Spaniards sang hymns before their cross. Two kinds of prayer rose into the same sky and collided in the wind. The gods perhaps listened, or perhaps they had already turned away. The narrator's voice deepens, the words almost swallowed by the sound of distant thunder. The first war of gods was fought in silence. And beneath that silence, something begins to shift. A tremor of mistrust moves through the palace halls. Moctezuma's dreams grow darker. Cortés's patience grows thin. The city glows like a candle surrounded by gathering wind. Beautiful, fragile, doomed to flicker. The prayers continue, but they no longer sound like worship. They sound like warning. And as the final note of song fades, the narrator whispers. As prayers turn to commands, the air tightens, betrayal stirs. It began without a scream, without the clash of swords, without even the sound of defiance. The moment slipped into history quietly, as if silence itself had planned it. Moctezuma, the emperor of the Mexica, the living son of Tenochtitlan, was taken prisoner in his own palace. The man who had ruled millions, whose word could still the air, now found himself surrounded by strangers who bowed without reverence. The cross had entered his chambers, and with it came an invisible chain. Cortés approached with a calm that hid calculation. His voice was gentle, the tone of a man explaining necessity rather than declaring conquest. He told the emperor that he would remain free, that this was not imprisonment but protection, a precaution against unrest, a temporary arrangement for mutual safety. His words, softened by Malinche's measured translation, glided like silk across the room. Moctezuma nodded, not because he believed, but because disbelief is slower than action. By the time his court realized what had happened, the Spaniards had already taken position around the doors. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing had changed. The markets opened, the canals glittered, the sun rose as always. But in the hearts of the people, a shadow had fallen. Rumors spread faster than light across water. The emperor was ill. The emperor was meditating. The emperor was resting under divine command. None dared speak the word captive. The very idea was heresy. How could a god be held by men who did not believe in him? Inside the palace, the air thickened with ritual restraint. The Spaniards treated Moctezuma with courtesy. They bowed. They offered food. They spoke with respect. Yet the space between civility and control was narrow. The emperor's chambers were filled with light, the golden walls catching each flicker of torch and turning it into mockery. At night, when the candles burned low, his reflection danced along the surfaces hundreds of Moctezumas trapped in gold. Cortés visited often, speaking through Malinche, weaving words like nets. He assured the emperor that peace would be preserved, that together they could rule both worlds, the old and the new. He promised friendship, alliance, eternity through faith. But behind every sentence lay an unspoken truth. Power had changed hands. The emperor's throne still stood, yet its shadow now belonged to another. Moctezuma listened, serene in appearance, but the serenity was armor. Inside, his thoughts moved like trapped birds. The omens had come true, though not in the way he had feared. The gods had not destroyed the world, they had abandoned it. He wondered if he himself had been the final sacrifice, offered not upon an altar of stone but upon the altar of history. His faith, once vast enough to hold a cosmos, now narrowed to a single point: endurance. He was allowed to hold court, to receive his nobles, to perform the motions of rule. But everyone could see it, the hesitation, the tremor of the voice that once commanded storms. His courtiers knelt lower, not out of reverence, but confusion. Some averted their eyes, unable to bear the sight of a god diminished. The priests lit more incense, as though smoke could hide the truth. The city's heartbeat slowed. Cortés, meanwhile, sent messages to his allies and enemies alike, signing them with the authority of the emperor himself. Moctezuma's seal, once sacred, now served foreign hands. Each decree weakened the illusion of sovereignty until it became theatre one, performed for an audience too afraid to look away. The Spaniards patrolled the palace halls, armor glinting like insects in sunlight. Their laughter echoed through courtyards that had once heard only prayer. At times, Moctezuma tried to reclaim his dignity. He summoned Cortés and demanded explanation. "Why?" he asked. "Did the gods permit this humiliation?" Cortés replied that his god, unlike the others, did not require blood, only faith. "Faith in what?" the emperor asked. Cortés paused, as if unsure whether to answer truthfully. "In power," he said finally, "and in the hand that wields it." That night, the emperor stood at his window, gazing over the sleeping city. He saw torches reflected in the lake, their flames rippling as if the water itself pitied him. He could not tell whether the people still worshipped him, or whether they had already turned their prayers elsewhere. The air felt strange, heavy with the smell of iron and candle wax. Somewhere in the darkness, a Spanish soldier coughed an ordinary sound, but it struck the emperor like prophecy. Even the silence of his own city no longer belonged to him. Malinche visited him sometimes, not as translator but as witness. She spoke softly. Her eyes lowered. She told him of Cortés's ambitions, of Spain's distant king, of the belief that one god must rule over all. Moctezuma listened, weary but curious. "And do you believe this god will spare your people?" he asked. Malinche hesitated. "No," she said at last, "but perhaps he will remember them." The emperor smiled faintly, a gesture that felt older than sorrow. The days blurred together, rituals continued, but meaning drained from them like water through cracked stone. The priests still burned incense, the Spaniards still prayed. In the courtyard, the two altars stood side by side, the cross and the knife, sunlight and shadow, locked in silent argument. The emperor's golden cage gleamed, but its bars grew colder with each passing day. Beyond the palace, the people began to murmur. Whispers reached the markets, the canals, the outer temples. "Our sun no longer rises," they said. "Our God no longer speaks." Some claimed they had seen him at the window, his face pale and distant, no longer divine. Others said he had already died, and what sat on the throne was only his shadow. The empire trembled not yet in rebellion, but in disbelief. Inside his chamber, Moctezuma prayed one last time before the obsidian mirror. Its surface showed no visions, only his own reflection, tired, fragile, human. He placed his hand against it and whispered, "If this is punishment, let it be final." The mirror stayed dark. Even the gods had learned to avert their eyes. In the plaza below, the drums began again soft at first, then swelling into rhythm. It was not yet war, but memory returning. The Spaniards stiffened, uncertain whether the sound meant celebration or warning. Cortés stood at the window beside the emperor, listening. "Your people call for you," he said. Moctezuma did not reply. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where smoke rose faintly above the rooftops. The sun had begun to set, casting the city in red. He looked smaller in that light, like a man being absorbed into his own legend. The narrator's voice falls to a near whisper, the tone of prophecy fulfilled. The empire's sun was chained in golden light. The streets were quiet. The gods watched and said nothing. The people obeyed not from loyalty, but disbelief. A pause. Then, far away, the drums change tempo. The rhythm sharpens. The stillness begins to shake. And the stillness breaks with distant drums, rebellion rising. It was meant to be a day of joy. The festival of Tenochtitlan, the month of renewal, when music rose like incense to the heavens, and the gods were reminded that life still shimmered beneath the sun. Even the prisoners who had been chosen as symbols of the divine were dressed in beauty. Gold dusted their skin. Feathers crowned their hair. The air was alive with flute and drum, with the laughter of those who believed that celebration itself could keep the world from tilting. The Spaniards watched from the shadows of the palace courtyard, their faces unreadable beneath the gleam of steel. Cortés was away, called to meet new threats along the coast. In his absence, he had left command to Pedro de Alvarado, quick-tempered, suspicious, uneasy amid rituals he did not understand. The drums unsettled him. The colours felt too bright, the dances too free. He had heard rumours that the Aztecs planned to rise, that the festival was only a mask for murder. And so he gave an order, whispered more from fear than certainty. "Close the gates." Inside, the dancers continued, unaware. Their feet struck the stone in perfect rhythm, their hands raised toward the sun. The sound of flutes and rattles wove through the air like a single heartbeat. It was music born from centuries of faith, the sound of a civilization believing itself eternal. And then, all at once, the rhythm changed. A single note broke a flute, cut short in mid-breath. Then came the clash of metal. The Spaniards moved through the crowd like a shadow-given form, swords flashing in the sunlight. The first victims fell without understanding what had begun. Feathers scattered, gold ornaments splintered under boots. For a few moments the music and the screams overlapped, indistinguishable. The narrator's voice slows, calm as dusk. Horror arrives most quietly when it begins inside a song. The Aztecs tried to flee, but the exits were sealed. The soldiers cut down the drummers' first silence as strategy. Without rhythm, the dancers lost their steps, their bodies colliding in confusion. Blood sprayed against the bright murals of the courtyard, staining them into something new. Those who reached for weapons found none. This was a ceremony of peace. Their only defense was disbelief. Alvarado shouted orders that no one could hear above the chaos. His men moved methodically, blades rising and falling in arcs that caught the sun. The sound of metal against flesh replaced the music that had filled the morning. The smell of blood thickened the air until even the flowers seemed to wither. Somewhere, a child began to cry. Somewhere else, a priest fell to his knees, chanting prayers that turned to coughing. The water in the courtyard's basin darkened, rippling with every collapse. Through it all, the Spaniards' faces remained blank, not cruelty, not rage, only a kind of cold efficiency. They had convinced themselves this was preemptive, necessary. Better to strike first, they reasoned, than to die in a storm of rebellion. Yet in their eyes flickered something deeper, Fear disguised as faith, violence baptized as order. The narrator lingers on detail the smallness of tragedy. A dancer's feather drifts across the courtyard, landing on a pool of red. A golden ankle bracelet rolls against stone, ringing once before falling silent. A hand, still, clutching a rattle, trembles as if unwilling to stop keeping time. Outside the temple, the city began to sense it. The music had stopped too suddenly. Mothers waiting in the square turned toward the sound of screams carried faintly on the wind. Courtiers ran to the palace gates and found them barred. The smell of smoke drifted out, followed by silence, a silence so dense it seemed to press against the skin. Inside, Alvarado stood among the dead. The floor shimmered slick beneath his boots, reflecting the red sky above. For a long moment, he said nothing. The drums were still. The air felt hollow, as though sound itself refused to return. He told his men to clear the bodies, to prepare defences. But even he must have known that defences meant little now. The unthinkable had already been done. Words spread through the city like flame through dry grass. Whispers became wails, wails became commands. The emperor, still confined within his palace, heard the noise and asked what had happened. His attendants answered with trembling lips. He turned away, his face pale beneath its painted calm. Outside his walls, the empire was beginning to wake not in awe, but in rage. By nightfall, the streets filled with torches. The people of Tenochtitlan gathered beneath the temple steps, shouting the emperor's name, demanding vengeance. The Spaniards peered from the battlements, their armor reflecting the firelight. They could feel the shift, that irreversible moment when fear changes direction. The same belief that had kept the people obedient now drove them toward fury. The narrator's tone softens, as if speaking to a dream unraveling. It is said the gods feed on sacrifice. Perhaps they grew full that day and turned away. Perhaps men simply took their place. Rain began to fall, a brief mercy. It washed the stones clean, but could not erase the colour. The plaza shimmered, its puddles glowing faintly like molten glass. The bodies were gone, yet their shapes lingered, burned into memory. The Spaniards barricaded themselves within the palace, torches flickering against the damp. From outside came the low rumble of drums, distant at first, then swelling not festival rhythm, but war. Moctezuma sent messengers to calm the crowd, to plead for reason, but none listened. His words no longer carried the weight of gods. The people had seen enough to know that divinity could bleed. They spoke now in the language of vengeance, their faith replaced by fury. The lake, usually calm at night, churned as if stirred by unseen hands. The moon broke through clouds, silver against the smoke. The city no longer shimmered with perfection. It pulsed alive, angry, awake. The Spaniards kept their weapons close. Alvarado, staring into the darkness beyond the walls, understood what Cortés had feared all along. Conquest, built on misunderstanding, must eventually answer to truth. And truth had begun to march. Inside the courtyard, the last candles flickered out, leaving only the glint of steel and the faint echo of what had once been music. The narrator's voice lowers to a whisper, almost tender. When music stops, civilizations collapse. A pause long enough for breath, not long enough for peace. And then, as blood seeped into the stone, the empire screamed awake. Night fell like judgment. Rain began softly, as if the sky hesitated to bear witness, then deepened until it roared across the city's stone and gold. The streets of Tenochtitlan gleamed beneath the storm, the reflections of torches flickering on the flooded causeways. Inside the Spanish quarters, fear thickened the air. The drums had not stopped for 3 days. The empire had risen, and it was coming for its captors. Moctezuma still lived, though barely. The emperor sat among foreigners, no longer divine, his body draped in the finery of a god, but the stillness of a man, already halfway gone. When the crowd gathered outside the palace, demanding his release, the Spaniards brought him to the balcony. Rain streaked his face as he lifted his hands, not in command but in plea. He called out for calm in a voice once said to command lightning, but no thunder answered. The people below hurled stones and curses. Some struck him, some struck the walls behind. Whether it was anger or accident that felled him, no one can say. By morning, the sun god of an empire lay silent on cold stone. The narrator's voice softens almost a prayer. No one ever learns whether he died by foreign steel or the hands of his own. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Perhaps fate itself struck the blow. Within the palace, panic spread. The Spaniards knew the illusion had shattered. Cortés, returned from the coast, found his men starving, surrounded, their ammunition nearly gone. The city that had once opened its gates now pulsed with vengeance. Warriors massed in the temples, spears glinting through the rain. The lake, once mirror, now felt alive, a vast, dark thing watching from below. Cortés gave the order none wanted to hear. They would flee under cover of night. They packed what gold they could carry, bars, ornaments, chains torn from temple walls. Greed clung even as death pressed closer. Some wept as they stripped the city's altars. Others kissed their crucifixes, whispering forgiveness to the God who had led them here. The sound of distant drums rolled across the water like approaching thunder. Midnight came. The rain did not stop. Cloaked in silence, the Spaniards slipped from the palace, leading horses and native allies through narrow causeways that stretched across the lake like veins of darkness. The torches had been doused. Only the pale shimmer of lightning revealed the faces beneath helmets, tired, soaked, terrified. They carried the weight of empire on their backs and the weight of sin in their pockets. For a moment, the plan held. The city slept fitfully, unaware that its conquerors were trying to vanish into the storm. But water remembers sound. A soldier slipped. A plank cracked. The splash echoed farther than it should have. The sentries on the temple steps turned toward it, and the night exploded into war. The drums resumed thunder upon thunder. Horns blared from every district. Torches flared like new stars as warriors poured into the streets, arrows raining down from rooftops and causeways. The Spaniards pressed forward, stumbling through mud and rain, horses screaming as they lost footing on slick stone. The causeways, narrow and broken by canals, became death traps. Men fell into the water and did not rise. The narrator's voice flows like the storm itself. The lake that once bore flowers now bore bodies. The water turned red, the moon turned away. Cortés fought his way forward, sword flashing between flashes of lightning. Around him, the air shimmered with chaos, the hiss of arrows, the cries of the wounded, the sound of gold spilling from broken chests into the water below. The greed that had driven them glittered once more, sinking faster than prayers. Soldiers hesitated, diving after it, vanishing beneath the surface. Malinche ran beside him, drenched, her hair clinging to her face, shouting translations no one could hear. The bridge ahead collapsed under the weight of men and horses. The Spaniards built makeshift crossings of shields and corpses, moving one step, one gasp at a time. The Aztecs fought with fury, not born of hatred, but of heartbreak. They had worshipped their emperor as divine, and now his death demanded restitution. The night became their altar. Warriors leapt into the water to drag down the invaders, knives flashing like silver fish beneath the rain. The Spaniards fired their muskets into darkness, the sound swallowed by storm. For every man who crossed the breach, 10 were lost. At the rear, the wagons overturned. Gold spilled out, shimmering beneath the water like a drowned sun. The lake accepted it without question. The soldiers who tried to save it disappeared armor, dragging them down faster than prayer could rise. Even the horses flailed, their bodies sinking with hollow groans that mingled with the thunder. Somewhere amid the chaos, Cortés was thrown from his horse. He rose, coughing lake water, his sword gone. For a heartbeat, he saw nothing but endless black sky and water indistinguishable. Then, lightning split the clouds, and he saw what had become of his army. Bodies strewn across bridges, floating faces, eyes open and pale. For the first time, the conqueror wept. The survivors stumbled to the far shore as dawn began to stain the horizon. Of the hundreds who had entered the city, fewer than half remained. Their boots squelched in mud and blood, their faces blank with exhaustion. They collapsed beneath the trees, silent as ghosts. The rain eased, but the world stayed grey. Cortés stood apart, looking back across the lake. Tenochtitlan shimmered faintly in the distance, its temples rising through the mist, its fires dim against the morning light. The city still lived, magnificent even in wrath. The narrator whispers, "It is said the sun rose late that morning, reluctant to look upon what had been done. Behind them, the lake grew still again. The causeways were quiet now, lined with wreckage, broken spears, overturned wagons, fragments of gold glinting beneath the surface. The water had swallowed the story whole, but not forever. Even now, it murmured with memory, carrying pieces of men and empire alike toward the unknown. They would call it La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Yet sorrow is too small a word. It was a baptism of blood, an ending written in water. No one won that night. The gods had simply changed their audience. As dawn spread across the valley, the survivors gathered in silence. No prayers were spoken, no orders were given. Each man stared into the rising light as though seeing it for the first time. The rain had washed the gold from their hands, leaving only mud and guilt. The camera lingers on Cortés standing ankle-deep in the shallows, the wind tugging at his cloak. Behind him, the lake gleams faintly half mirror, half grave. The narrator's voice fades to a hush. The night that drowned an empire and its conquerors alike. A pause. Dawn rises, and the survivors vow revenge. The rain had passed, but the world it left behind no longer felt alive. The survivors of the night of sorrows limped through the valleys, their faces pale with exhaustion, their eyes hollowed by disbelief. The gold they had carried was gone. The armor that once gleamed now clung to their bodies like weight meant for the grave. The sun rose slowly, reluctant to warm them. Cortés did not look back toward the lake. He no longer needed to the city, lived inside his mind now, burning behind his eyelids whenever he closed them. He gathered what remained of his army beneath the shadows of the mountains. There were fewer than 200 Spaniards left, along with a scattering of allies who had not yet turned against him. They built fires that gave little heat and prayed to a god who, for the first time, seemed silent. Cortés moved among them without speaking. The man who had once burned ships now stared into the ashes, as though remembering how little control fire truly offers. But survival was its own kind of faith. Within days, he began to rebuild. Messengers were sent to old enemies of the Aztecs, the Tlaxcalans, the Totonacs, the disillusioned cities that had once paid tribute to Tenochtitlan. To them, he spoke not of conquest but of vengeance. He told them that the empire of Moctezuma was fractured, that the gods had abandoned their chosen city, that together they could tear down what had once ruled them all. His words were smoke and promise, and desperation made them believable. One by one, the allies returned. Old rivalries gave way to opportunity. Spears were repaired, horses nursed back to strength, and the broken army began to breathe again. Yet the calm that settled over them was not peace. It was the stillness before the next storm. Cortés spent his nights studying maps drawn in the dirt, tracing the causeways back toward the lake, whispering strategies to the fire. To his men, it sounded like prayer. To himself, it sounded like guilt made useful. Meanwhile, within the walls of Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs rebuilt. The city still stood proud, though scarred. The bodies from the massacre had been carried away, the blood washed from the stones, the canals reopened to flow once more. But something unseen had entered with the strangers, something smaller than a grain of dust, and heavier than any curse. It moved from breath to breath, skin to skin, invisible and unstoppable. It began with fever. The first to fall were the servants who had handled the Spaniards' garments. They shivered through the night, covered in blisters that glowed like embers under the skin. Within days, the sickness spread through the markets, the temples, the canals. Whole families vanished into silence, houses sealed with reeds to keep the sickness in or to keep others out. Priests blamed the gods for allowing impurity. Doctors burned herbs and whispered spells. But the air itself had become a weapon. The narrator's voice softens, almost pitying. It was not war that conquered them, but breath. The dead became the conqueror's greatest allies. No one knew the word time's smallpox asterisk, not even the men who had brought it. A single infected soldier, left behind in the chaos of the retreat, carried the curse into the city's heart. The disease spread faster than any army could march, indifferent to walls, to faith, to hierarchy. The empire that had survived famine and flood began to unravel from within, its glory suffocating under its own weight. In the emperor's palace, the new ruler Tlaloc tried to restore order. He banned festivals, halted trade, and demanded cleansing rituals. But even as he spoke, the sores bloomed across his skin. He died within weeks, another god undone by an invisible hand. The people buried him with reverence and terror, their chants mixing with the coughs that now echoed through every street. The lake, once fragrant with flowers, stank of sickness. Canoes drifted unmanned across its surface. The city, which had survived steel and storm, now faced an enemy without sound or shape. Mothers refused to look at their children's faces, afraid to recognize the same rash upon their own. The priests prayed, the warriors sharpened weapons that would find no battle. The gods were silent, perhaps ashamed, perhaps absent. The narrator's tone turns reflective. Even the divine must sometimes stand helpless before the smallest of things. Cortés heard of the plague through his scouts. When he learned that half the city was dying, he said nothing. His men whispered that it was divine judgment, that their god had chosen sides. Cortés neither confirmed nor denied it. In private, he crossed himself not in gratitude, but in unease. Victory born of plague did not feel like triumph. It felt like witnessing a miracle meant for someone else. As months passed, the sickness burned itself out, leaving behind a quieter ruin. The survivors of Tenochtitlan were thinner, slower, but not yet broken. The temples still stood. The drums returned, but their rhythm had changed slower, deeper, a heartbeat steady but fragile. The empire's eyes had dulled, but its pride remained. Cortés waited, patient as shadow. He trained his men, forged new weapons, gathered more native allies until his army had swelled beyond what it had ever been. He studied the patterns of the causeways, the tides of the lake, the weaknesses in the city's walls. He knew he would return, not as guest, not as prisoner, but as reckoning. One evening, he climbed a ridge overlooking the valley. From there he could see the faint shimmer of the lake, distant yet luminous under the setting sun. He thought of the first time he had seen it, a vision of paradise floating between worlds. Now, it looked smaller, quieter, almost mortal. He realized that conquest was never about glory. It was about endurance. Those who could wait longest, he thought, would always inherit the ruins. In Tenochtitlan, the same sun set over empty streets. The air still smelled of smoke and incense, but the sound of mourning had become part of the wind. The priests whispered that the gods had not died. They had only turned their faces away until balance returned. The people swept their temples clean, rebuilt bridges, and prayed that the foreigners had drowned with their greed. But across the valley, torches were already lighting again, one by one. The narrator's voice flows like the return of thunder. From both shores the drums began again, one for vengeance, one for destiny, two songs beating toward the same end. Cortés stood among his men, the firelight painting his armor red. He closed his eyes and listened to the rhythm rising from the valley, distant, ancient, alive. It was the same sound that had once welcomed him into paradise, the same pulse that had betrayed him. Now it called him back. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply listened as the rain began again, light at first, then heavier, washing the ash from his hands. The narrator's tone deepens into prophecy, the calm before another storm. The shadows returned to their marks, each waiting for the other to move first. But fate had already chosen its tempo. A drum beat returned this time from both sides. The siege began, not with the clash of armies, but with the slow tightening of a noose. From every causeway leading into Tenochtitlan, the Spaniards and their native allies advanced thousands of men, step by step, across the lake. The water lay black beneath the dawn, reflecting the silhouettes of burning ships that Cortés had ordered dismantled and turned into floating batteries. Their cannons waited like patient beasts, their mouths aimed at the heart of the city that once shimmered like a dream. Inside the city, the drums began again, deep, defiant, alive. The people had rebuilt their bridges, fortified their temples, filled their granaries. The new emperor, Cuauhtemoc, young and unflinching, had sworn that Tenochtitlan would not fall while he still breathed. He walked the terraces at night, barefoot upon the stones still stained by his uncle's blood. Around him, the priests burned incense until the air shimmered with visions. They told him the gods would not abandon the fifth sun, that the city itself was sacred and would devour all who dared profane it. At sunrise, the lake ignited. The Spanish brigantines moved forward, their sails pale as ghosts. Cannon fire echoed across the water, each blast folding into the next until the valley itself seemed to roar. The first causeway splintered under their assault. Warriors rushed to rebuild it, even as stones and bodies fell into the lake. Arrows filled the air like dark rain. Muskets answered with thunder. Between each volley, the drums kept time not to guide, but to remind. This was not merely battle, but ritual. The narrator's voice drifts between perspectives, as though belonging to both sides and neither. Asterisk. To the Spaniards, asterisk, it was holy war. A crusade to purge idols and plant the cross where demons once feasted. Every bullet fired, every prayer whispered, was an act of purification. Asterisk. To the Aztecs, asterisk, it was cosmic renewal, the gods testing their endurance, demanding proof of worth. Every drop of blood spilled was an offering, every scream a hymn. Between them lay the lake, reflecting both heavens, each believing its own light to be divine. Days passed into weeks. The city that had once glowed with festival colour now reeked of smoke and rot. The canals clogged with wreckage, shattered canoes, broken shields, bodies adrift like forgotten offerings. The Spaniards advanced, but slowly, every bridge they crossed collapsing behind them. The Aztecs fought with fire and obsidian, striking from rooftops, vanishing into water. The air filled with the smell of burning maize and salt, the sound of conch shells echoing like the cries of the old gods. Inside the Spanish camp, hunger and sickness stalked the ranks. The lake water turned foul, and every drink tasted of ash. Cortés walked among the wounded, his armor blackened, his eyes fixed, not on the battle, but on the horizon where the temples rose. He told his men that heaven itself watched them, that their suffering was proof of righteousness. But at night, alone, he heard the drums, and wondered whether the sound came from the enemy or from within. In the city, the same hunger ruled. The canals that once carried food now carried only shadows. People ate bark, rats, and leather. Still, they fought. Mothers placed small knives in the hands of their sons, whispering that to die was to feed the sun, and to live without honor was to freeze the world. Even the priests began to falter. Their prayers grew hoarse, their altars crowded with too much blood and too little faith. Then came the fire. Spanish cannons tore open the great aqueducts that fed the city, sending floods of mud and debris through the streets. The bridges burned one by one, turning the lake into a moat of flame. Smoke drifted upward in spirals that blotted out the sky. The sun dimmed behind it, a red coin bleeding into haze. Cortés pressed forward. He had long since stopped counting the dead. His face was grey with exhaustion, his hands shaking as he lifted his sword. "For God and Spain," he whispered, though the words felt brittle. Around him, his allies, men who had once feared the Aztecs, now charged with a fury born of centuries of tribute and humiliation. For them, this was revenge. For the Spaniards, salvation. For the gods, perhaps, only entertainment. The narrator's voice turns elegiac, a hymn to collapse. When two gods go to war, humanity is the offering. In the center of the city, the great temple still stood, its stairs slick with rain and blood. From its summit, Cuauhtemoc watched the horizon flicker. He could see the foreign sails moving across the lake, white against black water. Below him, his people fought in alleys where the ground itself smoked. He raised his spear and shouted until his voice broke, not to command, but to remind them that they were still alive. For every street taken, the Spaniards lost another. For every cannon fired, an echo answered from stone and heart. The siege became less a battle than a dialogue, one spoken in flame, answered in bone. Day blurred into night, rain mingled with blood until the difference no longer mattered. At times, there was silence, eerie, impossible. The kind that comes only when both sides run out of strength at once. In those moments, the city seemed to breathe again, as if deciding whether to endure another sunrise. Then, inevitably, a musket fired, a drum resumed, and the world exhaled violence once more. Weeks became months. The Spaniards' armor rusted in the humidity. Their horses stumbled through rubble. The Aztecs' temples cracked from fire and quake, yet still they climbed them, chanting into the smoke. Both armies believed they fought for heaven, but heaven had stopped listening. The gods had withdrawn behind the veil of cloud, leaving only men to interpret their silence. When the final assault came, it was not glorious, but inevitable. The Spaniards marched through ruins, water lapping at their knees. The lake reflected nothing now, not stars, not gods, only the dull glow of fire. The city's once singing canals now smelled of rot. The drums beat slower, as if mourning their own endurance. Cortés entered what had once been the emperor's courtyard. Statues lay toppled, altars cracked. He touched a piece of carved obsidian and whispered, "So ends the world of gods." Yet even as he spoke, a single arrow struck the wall beside him, quivering in defiance. He turned toward the sound and saw, through smoke, the silhouettes of warriors still fighting in the distance. Tenochtitlan refused to die quietly. The narrator's tone softens to a whisper of resignation. Both sides believed they fought for eternity. Both were right. Eternity had simply changed its shape. Above the ruins, the sky darkened. Smoke swallowed the sun, turning the afternoon into twilight. The drums faltered, one by one, fading into the rhythm of wind and flame. And then, silence. The drums fade to silence. Smoke covers the sun. At the end, there was no thunder, no final battle cry, only the slow unraveling of sound. The drums that had once shaken the valley now lay broken beside the temple steps. Smoke drifted over the city like memory, refusing to leave. The rain had stopped, yet water still covered the streets, not from the sky, but from the lake rising to reclaim what had always been its own. Tenochtitlan, once a floating jewel, began to sink. The Spaniards advanced through ruins that no longer resisted them. The air smelled of salt and ash. Every step stirred mud mixed with blood. They did not cheer, for victory here did not feel like triumph. It felt like the exhaustion of time itself. The lake lapped against collapsed walls, gentle, almost merciful, as if trying to hide the evidence of what men had done. Within the city, famine spread faster than fear. The canals, once shimmering with boats and laughter, had become channels of rot. Fish floated belly up. Flowers that once adorned festivals drifted in decay. Survivors crawled through the rubble, their eyes hollow, their ribs sharp beneath skin. They searched for food in the same streets where they had once feasted. Children gnawed on reeds. Mothers boiled leather into broth. The great marketplace, once the beating heart of empire, stood empty, echoing only with wind. The narrator's voice slows, a whisper filled with reverence and sorrow. The gods did not die, they simply stopped listening. In the temples, the priests continued their rituals, though even their faith had begun to tremble. They lit incense that no longer rose. The smoke hung low, as if the air itself had grown too heavy for prayer. Their chants broke into coughs, their songs into silence. They looked to the sky for signs, but the sun appeared dim, a wounded light behind a veil of dust. The old gods had turned away, or perhaps had never been there at all. Cortés moved through the ruins with an expression the men could not read. He had conquered cities before, but none that died so beautifully. Tenochtitlan did not burn, it dissolved. Its palaces crumbled into the lake with the quiet grace of stars sinking into dawn. Even destruction here seemed ceremonial. The conquerors walked as if through a cathedral of ghosts. At night, the fires of the Spaniards glowed from the rooftops of what was left, and their light flickered across the faces of the dead floating below. The lake had become a mirror of grief, reflecting both conqueror and conquered, indistinguishable in the shimmer. The sound of frogs returned to the canals, their croaks echoing through the ruins like laughter too distant to be cruel. The Aztec warriors who still lived fought on, though their weapons had long lost meaning. They struck from rooftops and doorways, desperate, skeletal, divine in their defiance. Even Cortés, watching them, felt something like awe. "They fight," he murmured, as if eternity were watching. Perhaps it was. But eternity was indifferent. Plague followed famine. Fever followed plague. The air carried death in its simplest form, a breath shared too closely. The corpses grew too many to bury. The lake, once holy, became grave. The smell of it seeped into everything: food, clothing, even prayer. The Spaniards, too, began to fall ill, their armor offering no protection against invisible gods. Both sides now knelt to the same unseen power disease, the only conqueror that demanded no allegiance. In the emperor's final days, Cuauhtemoc tried to rally what remained of his people. He climbed the steps of the great temple, though the stairway was cracked and the altar broken. From that height, he looked out upon a city of ghosts. The canals glimmered with moonlight and memory. The wind carried neither drums nor hymns, only the creak of empty boats drifting toward shore. He raised his arms to the heavens and whispered to the absent gods, "If we are forgotten, let us at least be remembered in silence." Then he descended, calm as dusk. When the Spaniards found him, he did not hide. He stood waiting, unarmed, wearing the headdress of kings. Cortés approached slowly, his men holding torches that hissed in the rain. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Cuauhtemoc said, "You have come too late. The city is already dead." Cortés nodded, though whether in agreement or pity, no one could tell. By morning, the resistance was over. The last bridges had collapsed, the temples smouldered, and the water had begun to rise over the lower streets. The Spaniards declared victory, though none felt victorious. They built crosses over the ruins, and called it peace. Yet even as they prayed, the ground beneath them trembled not with earthquake, but with the slow settling of a city returning to water. The narrator's tone softens into elegy. The empire did not fall in battle, it exhaled. The lake absorbed the blood, the ash, the tears, and carried them outward, until even the valley's edges tasted of salt. Birds returned, circling above the still canals, their wings mirrored in the red-tinged water. The city, once louder than thunder, now whispered through ripples and reeds. Years later, travellers would speak of walking upon the new city, built atop these ruins. A city that shone with cathedrals and palaces, yet hummed faintly beneath the stones. They said that when the rain came, the streets filled with reflections that did not match the living, that at night, if one listened closely, one could still hear drums beneath the water. Cortés, standing on the temple's shattered summit, looked down at what remained. His soldiers cheered behind him, their voices hollow against the enormity of silence. He did not join them. He gazed across the flooded city, where the horizon blurred between lake and sky, and whispered something only the wind could hear. Perhaps it was prayer, perhaps apology. The narrator pauses the breath between epochs. Every civilization believes it will outlive the storms it summons. Yet all share the same ending. Water returning to water, light fading into reflection. The lake swallowed the last embers. The sun, hidden behind the smoke, sank without ceremony. The world did not end. It simply forgot how to sing. And as the camera pulls back, the ruins shimmer beneath the waves. Temples softened into shadow, roads dissolving into silver. Above them, a new world begins to rise. The city that rose from the ashes of Tenochtitlan called itself new, but its stones remembered otherwise. Beneath the whitewashed facades and ringing bells of Mexico City, another world lay sleeping, a world of obsidian and gold, of gods buried alive beneath altars not their own. The Spaniards had declared victory, yet the ground they built upon refused to forget. When the wind moved through the narrow streets, it carried not only dust, but whispers. They began their work quickly, as if fearing the silence might remind them what it concealed. The old temples were torn apart, their blocks carried by hand to raise cathedrals and palaces. The Great Pyramid of Huitzilopochtli became the foundation for a church dedicated to the Virgin, a transfiguration of stone rather than spirit. The idols were melted into chalices, the altars became pulpits. Each hammer strike was both creation and burial. The narrator's voice slows, reverent and mournful. Every empire becomes the foundation of another's church. The streets of the new city followed the same grid as the old, yet the rhythm had changed. Where once processions of priests wound through incense and drums, now marched parades of soldiers, carrying banners marked with crosses. Latin prayers replaced Nahuatl hymns, but their cadence was not so different. In the evenings, when bells tolled across the valley, their echoes mingled with older sounds no one could quite name. Cortés was long gone, his fortune scattered across oceans, but his shadow lingered here. The plaza where he had proclaimed victory still stood vast and bright, its stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Beneath it, archaeologists would one day find layers of human remains, offerings to gods whose names had vanished from the mouths of men. The dead lay quietly, but not in peace. Even now, when rain falls in the heart of Mexico City, the water rises through cracks in the pavement, carrying flecks of obsidian and fragments of pottery to the surface. Commuters step over them without notice, never realizing they walk upon what was once the navel of the world. Every drop of rain remembers the lake that once mirrored the heavens. Every echo of thunder remembers the drums that once summoned gods. The city has changed its name, but not its pulse. The narrator walks through it, or seems to. The voice moves like mist through plazas and arcades, describing a city that breathes two realities at once. Here, it whispers, the cathedral's shadow falls exactly where the temple once stood. Here, the altar of Christ rests upon the heart of Huitzilopochtli. And here, beneath the marble floor, the bones of dancers from a forgotten festival still lie in perfect circles, as if waiting for the music to begin again. Tourists pass through, cameras in hand, chasing sunlight across carved facades. Street vendors call out their prices in voices that rise and fall like old chants. Children play in courtyards built upon sanctuaries, their laughter echoing off stones that once heard prayers in a language the wind no longer remembers. The gods are gone, but their silence hums beneath the cobblestones like a heartbeat beneath sleep. In the museums, behind glass, sit fragments of the empire that once was, masks of jade, knives of volcanic glass, necklaces made from the teeth of warriors. They are labelled, catalogued, tamed by context. Yet when the curator's footsteps fade, and the lights dim for the night, the objects seem to glow faintly in their cases, as if remembering the warmth of hands that once held them in worship. Even the cathedrals, grand and radiant, are not immune to memory. Their foundations shift each year, sinking slowly into the soft ground below the remnants of the lake that refuse to die. Engineers repair cracks, reinforce walls, and strengthen arches, but the city continues to sink, inch by inch, into its own reflection. The narrator calls it penance made architectural, the slow bowing of stone to what lies beneath. The Spanish chroniclers once wrote that the Aztecs vanished, consumed by conquest, erased by progress. But walk the streets long enough, and you will see their faces still, in the high cheekbones of passers-by, in the woven shawls that mimic old designs, in the food, the music, the unspoken reverence for the sun. The gods may have been renamed, but they were never dismissed. Even the Virgin, standing in her niche above the cathedral door, wears robes that shimmer like those of Tonantzin, the mother goddess of the earth. The conquerors had come to convert, but the land converted them instead quietly, patiently, through beauty. At night, when the crowds thin and the city exhales, the past rises. The wind snakes through alleyways, carrying scents of copal and candle wax. Bells toll from unseen towers, their notes trembling against the weight of centuries. In the plaza, pigeons roost on statues of saints whose faces erode faster than memory. The air feels thicker here, the way water feels thicker than air. Sometimes, if you listen closely, another rhythm joins the hum of engines and footsteps faint, like a drum beneath the floorboards. The narrator lingers in that sound, voice hushed. They say ghosts do not haunt the living. It is the living who haunt the ghosts, refusing to let them rest, walking daily upon their graves. The rain returns, soft at first, then steady. It pools in the dips of ancient stones, reflecting streetlights that flicker like candles. A taxi passes, its tires hissing through puddles that ripple outward concentric circles that mimic the patterns carved into the old sunstone. In that moment, the modern and the ancient blur completely. For a heartbeat, the city looks as it once did, luminous, floating, eternal. Then the rain breaks, and the vision fades. The lights return, the city breathes, but beneath its rhythm, the old world waits, unchanged. The narrator's tone deepens to a whisper, neither mournful nor hopeful, but reverent. Tenochtitlán did not die. It learned to hide beneath its own resurrection. The gods are still here, dreaming under marble and asphalt, listening to the prayers that no longer know their names. A pause. The camera begins to drift upward, the sound of rain softening to memory. But ruins never truly rest. The voice continues. They wait patient to be rediscovered. Time does not erase civilizations. It translates them. Beneath every language that claims victory, another continues, whispering, patient and unbroken. Nahuatl, the tongue of emperors, poets, and priests, still breathes beneath the surface of Mexico's streets, its syllables disguised as everyday words, its rhythm hiding inside laughter, prayer, and market noise. You hear it without hearing it. You speak it without knowing you do. The empire never ended. it merely changed its voice. The narrator walks through modern Mexico City, the rain of the previous night drying on sun-warmed stone. Vendors call out to passing crowds, chocolate, tomate, coyote, aguacate. Each word an echo from another age. Nahuatl phrases have survived colonization, not as relics, but as living breath. When someone orders chili, or says ocelotl, or quetzal, they summon fragments of the old world. The empire sleeps beneath the tongue, dreaming in vowels. Nahuatl once filled the air like birdsong, ceremonial, layered, precise. It was a language of metaphor, where every word contained a world. To say flower was also to say song. To say heart was to speak of the sun. It was not a language that described it revealed. Poets were priests, words were bridges, and speech itself was an offering. The narrator's tone drifts like wind through temple corridors. To speak was to build, to sing was to remember, to listen was to pray. When the Spaniards came, they tried to silence that music. They burned codices, outlawed rituals, replaced prayers with new saints' names. But the people obeyed only on the surface. In secret, Nahuatl folded itself into lullabies, into proverbs, into the rhythm of work, songs sung to the fields. It hid inside the language of those who conquered it, using Spanish as a mask. Even as cathedrals rose, the foundations murmured in the old tongue. The narrator slows, letting the words stretch, intimate and luminous. Languages do not die, they go underground. They become roots, and roots remember the way back to light. Centuries later, the same cadence still beats through Mexican life. The names of towns, Popocatépetl, Iztaccíhuatl, Xochimilco, are poems carved into maps, each carrying the memory of myth. Even the landscape refuses to forget. The volcanoes are lovers, the rivers, gods. Every mountain keeps its original name, as if the land itself denied translation. To walk across Mexico is to walk through a living scripture, where each syllable is a relic too sacred to decay. In the markets, women sell maize wrapped in husks, call it tamale, not bread. Men carve wooden animals, and call them alebrijes, dream creatures born from old spirits given new skin. The festivals blaze with hybrid splendor. Saints process through the streets, accompanied by drums that beat the same rhythm once offered to Huitzilopochtli. The Day of the Dead, now cloaked in Catholic imagery, still belongs to Mictacasíhuatl, lady of the underworld, whose flowers marigolds guide the spirits home. The people no longer build pyramids, but they still build altars. The gods are no longer named, but they are still fed. The narrator's voice folds into wonder. Empires vanish in stone, but they endure in color, in sound, in taste. Food itself becomes remembrance. A tortilla is both sustenance and symbol. The sun remade each morning by human hands. Chocolate, once sacred and reserved for ceremony, still carries the same reverence in its bitterness. To eat is to participate in the same ritual that once kept the cosmos alive. The Spanish brought their saints and wheat, but maize remained the pulse of existence. You can conquer land, you cannot conquer hunger shaped like history. Even the gestures remain the way candles are lit before journeys, the way water is sprinkled to calm a restless spirit, the way a name is spoken twice to invite attention. They are the grammar of continuity, movements that belong to neither past nor present, but to something older, the human need to remember through doing. The narrator now speaks as if walking through a dream layered over the city's surface. Listen closely, the voice says, and you'll hear Nahuatl in the spaces between other words not as sound but as rhythm, a cadence that refuses to fade, a breath that lives beneath the new air. For centuries, scholars dismissed Nahuatl as a relic, something to be studied rather than spoken. But in classrooms, in poetry, in song, it has begun to return. Young voices rise again, shaping the ancient syllables with pride and defiance. They speak to remember, but also to heal, to prove that silence was never victory. Across villages and cities, the language breathes anew, a resurrection not of empire, but of identity. A poet recites under dim light, "We were not destroyed. We were translated." The audience listens, and something within them recognizes the sound not intellectually but instinctively, as if memory were written in the marrow. For a moment, the centuries fold inward, and the old empire stands again, invisible but intact. The narrator's tone turns reflective, almost sacred. Perhaps civilization is not measured by the monuments it leaves, but by the metaphors it survives. In the museums, visitors stare at glyphs etched into stone spirals, feathers, suns. They see art, they do not see language. Yet each curve was once a sentence, each line a thought. The stones remain untranslated, not because we cannot read them, but because they were written for gods who no longer answer. Still, they glow faintly under glass, as if waiting for someone to speak the right name and wake them. The voice softens, memory never dies. It migrates. It wears new faces, new accents, new masks. It waits inside us, disguised as habit, as taste, as song. And so, the empire continues in the rhythm of markets, the flavor of maize, the sound of children's laughter beneath cathedral bells. The gods no longer need temples. They live in the spaces between words, in the moments when history forgets to divide the living from the remembered. The narrator's final lines drift like a spell returning to its source. Listen carefully the next time you walk these streets. The language you hear is not one but two, one speaking in daylight, the other beneath it. The first tells the story of conquest. The second hums of survival. A pause, soft, unhurried. What if the empire never ended? The narrator whispers. What if it simply changed its voice? The sound fades, the hum of the modern city dissolving into a faint echo of drums, distant, patient, eternal. And then, through the silence, a new voice begins to rise, steady, curious, alive. The scholar, the archaeologist, the dreamer. It began, as all rediscoveries do, with an accident. In 1978, electricians digging in the heart of Mexico City struck something solid beneath the pavement, not concrete, not brick, but carved stone. When the dust cleared, a face stared back at them. The moon goddess Cuauhtemoc, her body dismembered yet radiant, her expression calm as eternity. The workers stepped away in silence. Beneath their feet, beneath centuries of asphalt and empire, the old city had been waiting. The archaeologists came with shovels and brushes, with notebooks and reverence. They peeled away the modern city layer by layer, sidewalks, foundations, sewer lines, until the buried world breathed again. What they found was not ruin, but rhythm. Stairways rising from mud, serpent heads coiled in patience, altars still aligned to the sun's return. Tenochtitlan had not vanished. It had only learned to whisper. The narrator's voice moves with awe, soft as wind through excavation dust. What if the gods waited for us to remember them? The discovery of the Templo Mayor, the great temple of the Mexica, transformed myth into memory. Scholars once believed it lost, devoured by the Spanish city above. Yet here it stood, emerging like a tide reversing time itself. Beneath layers of concrete and cathedral, the sacred twin pyramids reappeared, one dedicated to Tlaloc, god of rain, the other to Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war. Two halves of a world once balanced on blood and faith. The stones bore no resentment. They simply revealed themselves, as though proud to be seen again. As excavations deepened, offerings surfaced. Obsidian knives still sharp enough to cut skin, shells from distant coasts, jade beads shaped like tears, children's bones wrapped in woven cloth. The archaeologists catalogued each fragment with trembling care, aware that every discovery was both miracle and intrusion. They worked under the gaze of skyscrapers, surrounded by the hum of traffic. Yet below them, the silence was older than empire. Every brushstroke uncovered a heartbeat. Every artifact carried the weight of a prayer, once thought lost. The narrator lingers on that image, the living and the dead sharing one address. Above, engines. Below, eternity. Between them, the thin breath of memory. In museums across the world, other relics began to speak again. The codices, once banned and burned, resurfaced in archives and private collections. Their colours, vermilion, turquoise, gold, pulsed as vividly as when they were first painted. Scholars traced the pictographs, following their serpentine language through centuries of silence. The stories they told were not of savagery, as once believed, but of science, astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, the geometry of devotion. The Aztecs had mapped the heavens with more accuracy than their conquerors ever realized. The empire's legacy was not merely conquest, but comprehension. The narrator's tone deepens, carrying both pride and regret. History, rewritten by those who buried it, now rewrites itself. Each find reassembled another piece of the world once lost. A clay flute still played its original tone. A carved obsidian mirror reflected the face of the viewer, and, behind it, another, shadowed, ancient, infinite. The archaeologists, covered in dust, became priests of revelation. They worked not to conquer, but to listen. Every artifact spoke a fragment of truth, and together those fragments formed a chorus, faint but unmistakable, rising through the centuries like smoke finding its way out of stone. Visitors came from across the world to stand before these rediscovered temples. They gazed through glass at the moon goddess, the serpent heads, the offerings laid in spirals to mimic the universe. Some bowed, some only stared. Children pressed their palms against the display cases, unaware that they were touching the breath of their ancestors through time. The city, once proud of its forgetting, now found itself haunted by gratitude. Above the excavations, the cathedral bells still rang, their echoes falling into the open pit where the ancient stairs rose. The sound mingled with the sigh of wind moving across uncovered stone. Two faiths, separated by centuries, sang together without meaning to one of conquest, the other of return. The narrator whispers, "Perhaps the gods never left. Perhaps they simply changed their temples from pyramids of stone to the minds of those who remember." Scholars argue over meanings, over dates, over rituals, over the true nature of sacrifice, but the dust offers no debate. It reveals what it chooses. In the silence between discoveries, some claim they feel a pulse beneath the ground, faint but rhythmic, like the slow beating of a heart too old to die. The archaeologists smile when asked about it. They call it vibration from the subway lines. But when the wind shifts, when the machines quiet, when the day ends and the lamps dim, they all admit the same thing. Sometimes the earth feels alive. And perhaps it is, for memory is not static. It breathes through those who seek it. The city that once drowned beneath conquest now resurrects itself piece by piece. Its voice returns not in vengeance, but in wonder, reminding those who listen that forgetting is only temporary, that silence is never final. The narrator walks through the excavation site at dusk. The air smells of rain and limestone dust. The last rays of sunlight strike the stones, igniting the carvings in brief fire before fading. Workers pack their tools, leaving behind open trenches where time remains visible. The city above hums with neon and engines, unaware that eternity sleeps only a few meters below. History, the voice says, is not a line, but a circle that waits for us to close it. As night falls, the site glows under soft lights, golden against the surrounding darkness. The temple looks less like ruin than resurrection, a wound reopening to breathe. Somewhere, a flute is played by a street musician, its melody drifting down into the pit. For a moment, it sounds ancient, familiar, like the city itself is humming along. The narrator's voice quiets, almost to a sigh. Every civilization ends twice, once in fact, and once in forgetting. The second death is the crueler. But the dead have begun to speak again, and the earth has learned to listen. The camera lingers on the illuminated stones, the carvings catching shadows that seem to move of their own accord. And then, with breath drawn like a closing prayer, but memory is never innocent. The gods may have fallen, but their shadows never left. They linger in murals, in dreams, in the ways light moves across the valley at dawn. Their names have faded from common speech, yet their symbols remain not as superstition, but as language deeper than memory. The feathered serpent, the obsidian mirror, the reborn sun, all still breathe within us, disguised as instinct, as imagination, as the quiet pulse of continuity. Civilizations die, symbols don't. The narrator's voice glides through still air, calm and reverent. Perhaps mythology was never meant to explain the past, but to preserve the human mind from forgetting what it needs to believe. The first symbol to rise again is Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, god of wind and wisdom, who once taught humanity how to speak and measure time. His image appears on museum walls and in graffiti, in jewelry and textbooks. But what endures is not his face. It is the contradiction he embodies. Flight and earth, dream and dust, heaven tied to hunger. To the Aztecs, he was proof that divinity could be gentle, that knowledge itself could be sacred. To the modern mind, he remains an idea that refuses to age, that wisdom and compassion can coexist with power. Every civilization invents a god to explain its conscience. The Spaniards had their cross, the Mexica had their serpent, yet both spoke of resurrection. When the conquistadors arrived, some believed Quetzalcoatl had returned in foreign flesh, not prophecy, but metaphor fulfilled. Even now, the myth survives as a warning. Those who forget their gods will mistake strangers for them. The camera lingers on carvings of the serpent unfurling across temple stones, the narrator whispering, "In every culture, the divine learns to crawl before it learns to fly." Then comes the mirror obsidian, black as still water. It was said that Tezcatlipoca, god of fate and reflection, could see everything within it. The future, the heart, the truth behind illusion. When priests gazed into polished obsidian, they claimed to see, not themselves, but what they might become. It was never a mirror of vanity, it was a mirror of consequence. The Spaniards, when they first found these dark discs, mistook them for weapons. In a way, they were. The mirror does not kill, it reveals. Today, the mirror lives in psychology more than religion. Every time a person looks inward, questioning motive, facing memory, they repeat the old ritual. The narrator says softly, "The obsidian mirror survives in every human doubt." It reminds us that introspection is both terror and truth, that the divine may not judge us, but reflection always will. The third symbol is the sun Huitzilopochtli's eternal struggle. To the Aztecs, each dawn was a battle won, each sunset a risk of extinction. The sun was not guaranteed, it had to be earned. They believed the world had died 4 times already, reborn through sacrifice and faith. To keep it alive was to live with awareness that existence itself is fragile. It was not nihilism but awe, a recognition that meaning requires maintenance. The narrator's voice carries a note of admiration. They lived each day as if the cosmos depended on them. Perhaps it did. In modern Mexico, the same sun burns above the same mountains. The people no longer offer hearts, but they still rise with the dawn, still build, still love, still sing each act a small defiance against oblivion. The old belief has simply changed form, survival as devotion, creation as sacrifice. When a mother wakes before daylight to make tortillas, when a musician plays through hunger, when a worker builds cities for generations, he will never meet, these are new prayers for the same sun. The myths have become metaphors, the metaphors truths. Scholars translate the stories as allegory, but the narrator suggests something gentler. That myth was never false, only misread. It was psychology before the word existed, a map of the mind drawn in stars and blood. The gods were not distant forces. They were the shapes of emotion made eternal rage, as Tlaloc, love as Xochiquetzal, memory as Mictlantecutli. Every story was an anatomy of the soul disguised as the universe. The camera drifts across artifacts, feathers turn to dust, masks cracked by centuries, still glowing faintly as if lit from within. To lose a myth, the voice says, is to lose a mirror of meaning. Yet these mirrors endure. Every Mexican child who learns the legend of the fifth sun, every poet who writes of rain and rebirth, carries fragments of the old faith without realizing it. The myths did not vanish. They evolved, weaving themselves into identity, turning history into instinct. Even science, the modern god of reason, has inherited their rhythm. Astronomers still trace the same constellations the Aztecs worshipped. Mathematicians still count in cycles. Artists still carve suns and serpents into metal and paint. When rockets launch into the sky, streaking fire across the dawn, they mimic the same arc once drawn by Huitzilopochtli each morning. Progress, it seems, is just mythology given new vocabulary. The narrator breathes between sentences, the tone becoming meditative. We call it psychology now, the understanding that darkness gives birth to light, that creation requires destruction, that every rebirth demands a death. The Aztecs called it faith, we call it resilience, but it is the same fire spoken in a different tongue. In murals painted on school walls, Quetzalcoatl winds between factory smokestacks and solar panels. In music, the beat of drums still finds its way beneath modern rhythms. Even the obsidian mirror has returned in the glass of smartphones, reflecting faces back at themselves, asking unspoken questions. We no longer kneel before the gods, but we still stare into their symbols, seeking purpose in reflection. The camera moves through night neon lights flickering where torches once burned. The same patterns repeat. Order built upon ruin, ruin reborn as order. Civilization remains what it always was, a dialogue between forgetting and remembering. The narrator's voice lowers to a whisper that feels like a blessing. Perhaps we do not inherit the gods themselves, but the questions they asked. What is power without mercy? What is creation without cost? What is light without the courage to face shadow? The wind moves through the valley, carrying echoes of old chants. In the distance, volcanoes glimmer under moonlight. Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, the eternal lovers, still guarding the city. Their shapes are the last temples the gods allowed to remain untouched. As the night deepens, the camera tilts upward. The narrator breathes, calm and certain. Civilizations die, symbols don't. They adapt, they translate, they wait. The serpent still flies, the mirror still reflects, the sun still rises. A pause, like an inhale held across centuries. The camera drifts upward from symbols to stars. Night has fallen again over the valley. The lake is gone, drained, and buried beneath centuries of stone. But when rain gathers on the streets of Mexico City, the reflections return brief, trembling, infinite. Streetlights shimmer where temples once burned. A ripple in the water could be a memory or a prophecy. The city has forgotten its own reflection, but the reflection has not forgotten the city. The narrator's voice emerges slowly, as if from deep water. Every civilization believes it will last forever. Every one of them is wrong and right. In the ruins of Tenochtitlan, archaeologists sift through bones and jade. Above them, skyscrapers hum with electricity. The same valley that once carried the sound of drums now carries the murmur of engines, yet the rhythm has not changed. Each age builds its monuments upon the silence of another. Each believes itself chosen, permanent, beyond the reach of time. But time has patience greater than faith. It waits until belief becomes arrogance, until progress becomes echo. The Aztecs believed they were the guardians of the fifth sun, the final world, the culmination of all that came before. The Spaniards believed their empire was the hand of God on earth, ordained to bring light to darkness. Both built their faith upon inevitability, and both learned the same lesson. Nothing divine guarantees endurance. Power is a flame that must burn its own hand to be seen. The narrator's tone softens, almost kind. What if every empire carries the seed of its own extinction and rebirth? History does not move forward, it circles. The same pride that built pyramids builds skyscrapers. The same faith that demanded blood now demands belief in markets and machines. We call our rituals modern, our gods invisible, our offerings abstract, but the rhythm is ancient. The world we inhabit hums with the same hunger for permanence that haunted every civilization before us. And like them, we mistake noise for immortality. In the calm between sentences, the narration feels like breathing slow, meditative. Look closely, it says. The circle never ended. The Aztecs fed their gods to keep the sun alive. We feed ours with data, with attention, with the currency of time itself. They watched the horizon for omens. We watch screens. They feared the day the heavens would stop turning. We fear the day our world goes quiet. Each generation inherits the same dread that the end will arrive not with fire, but with silence. Yet even silence renews. The voice drifts like smoke. The fall of one world becomes the soil of the next. Across millennia, the same story repeats in different languages. Sumeria drowned, Egypt faded, Rome fractured, the Aztec sun set beneath foreign sails. And now, beneath our towers of glass, we too build on fault lines, political, ecological, spiritual, pretending the ground beneath us is still. But beneath every certainty, something ancient shifts. The future has always been a repetition of the past, disguised as innovation. And yet, there is peace in this. The narrator's tone turns tender, offering comfort rather than warning. If all things return, then so does meaning. What was lost can be found again. What was buried will speak. The ruins beneath Mexico City whisper this truth nightly. Every drop of rain that seeps into the soil touches both past and present. Every stone of the cathedral rests upon another civilization's prayer. The sound of church bells echoes through the same air that once carried the conch shells of the priests. Time does not erase its layers, and within those layers lies the shape of eternity, repetition as revelation. We are taught to fear endings, but the Aztecs understood that destruction is only another form of balance. Their gods died daily so the world could continue. They knew that the sun must fall before it can rise again. The narrator breathes. To the ancient mind, apocalypse was not the end, it was renewal disguised as flame. Perhaps that is why their story haunts us. The fall of Tenochtitlan is not merely history, it is metaphor. It reminds us that collapse is not failure but memory reasserting itself. When an empire falls, it becomes visible again, stripped of illusion, stripped of noise, forced to remember what mattered. Civilization devours itself to find its own heart. The camera drifts through the ruins, over carved stones half buried in earth, over city lights glimmering above. The two worlds blur, ancient and modern, ruin and metropolis, silence and song. The narrator whispers, "We are all the children of forgotten gods, building new heavens on borrowed ground." Beneath this calm, a subtle warning hides not of punishment, but of reflection. For history, like the obsidian mirror, shows us not the past, but ourselves. We gaze into the ruins and see our own empires forming, our own faiths trembling, our own illusions taking shape. We see the same belief that blinded Moctezuma, the same hunger that drove Cortés, the same quiet conviction that the world belongs to us. And still, the voice remains soft, almost forgiving. Perhaps it must be so. Perhaps forgetting is the only way humanity learns to remember. The final images unfold like a slow heartbeat. The lake, imagined as it once was, mirrors the stars. The old temples rise ghost-like through the water, then fade again. Modern towers shimmer above them, their windows catching the same starlight. The city sleeps, its breath aligned with the ancient rhythm beneath. The narrator's voice lowers, intimate as a secret shared before sleep. There is no final empire, no final faith, no final truth. There is only the turning, the endless cycle of rise and fall, death and return. We are not the first dreamers, nor will we be the last. For a moment, silence holds. The sound of wind, faint and eternal, fills the space between words. The audience is left not with despair, but with a strange, luminous calm, the comfort of knowing that nothing truly ends, that all things, even ruin, are part of a breathing whole. The voice concludes, softer now, like the last line of a prayer. History sleeps, but never dies. Beneath the heart of Mexico City, the lake still remembers. You cannot see it, but it moves underfoot, slow, secret, breathing through cracks in the earth. Each tremor, each puddle after rain, is a pulse from the world beneath. The city believes it stands on solid ground, yet the old water waits, patient, holding everything that came before, temples, bones, gold, and memory. The narrator's voice returns low, calm, almost a lullaby. The empire didn't vanish, it learned how to dream underwater. The camera glides through the dark, beneath foundations and pipes, past layers of earth where fragments of obsidian gleam like eyes. Down here, time no longer moves in years, but in heartbeats. Archaeologists in yellow light kneel among the ruins, their hands brushing dust from carved serpents, from stones still warm with stories. Every discovery feels less like digging through soil, and more like listening to a language the ground refuses to stop speaking. One worker lifts a clay mask from the mud, its features smoothed by centuries, yet unmistakably human. Another uncovers the edge of a temple stair, perfectly aligned to the rising sun. Above them, traffic hums, church bells ring, a city unaware that it stands on the chest of something still alive. The camera lingers on their faces, modern eyes staring into an ancient pulse. The narrator whispers, "The city still breathes." When it rains, water gathers at the base of excavations. Drops fall in rhythm, echoing like distant drums. The archaeologists pause to listen a sound too regular to be accident, too human to be forgotten. They cannot say what it is, only that it feels familiar, as if the city itself remembers how to sing. Rainwater seeps into the old canals, tracing the same paths that once carried the blood of sacrifices and the glow of lanterns. Beneath the cathedral, beneath the markets and museums, these channels weave through the darkness veins in the body of a dream that refuses to die. Sometimes, at night, when the noise above fades and the air turns heavy, people swear they hear something beneath the streets, the faint rhythm of paddles, the whisper of distant voices. The sound never lasts, yet it always returns. The narrator continues softly, almost to themselves. Every civilization leaves behind a hum, the residue of everything it believed, feared, and loved. If you listen closely enough, you can still hear it beneath the ground. A camera pans slowly through the excavation site, where spotlights illuminate the carved faces of gods emerging from earth like dawn from shadow. Tlaloc, Lord of Rain, gazes upward again, his eyes blank but his presence immense. Nearby lies a serpent carved in stone, its body coiled around the remnants of a wall. To the modern eye, these are artifacts. To time, they are memories exhaling. The archaeologists map the ruins, measure them, photograph them. Yet what they cannot record is the feeling that the air here is thicker, that history presses close enough to touch. Some speak of strange dreams after working below ground, visions of cities made of light, of water that reflects the sky so perfectly that one cannot tell which is real. They wake with the taste of salt and the echo of drums in their ears. The narrator's voice rises like mist. Perhaps the city dreams through them. Perhaps we are all vessels for what refuses to be forgotten. The film slows. Light flickers across the walls of the excavation. Torchlight, candlelight, streetlight, centuries blending together. The soundtrack fades until only breath and wind remain. Then, softly, a new sound emerges, the tremor of distant bells mixing with the drip of water. The tone is neither sorrowful nor triumphant. It is continuity. The camera drifts upward, moving through layers of time. Past the archaeologists, past the cathedral floor, past the asphalt and crowds. The modern city unfolds above, alive with motion cars, laughter, lights flickering in windows. And yet, for a heartbeat, its shapes align with something older. Streets follow invisible canals. Towers mimic temple steps. Neon crosses shimmer where flames once rose. The city has changed its name, but not its pattern. It still floats. The narrator whispers again. Tenochtitlán never ended. It only learned to breathe through another face. As the camera rises higher, the lake reveals itself imagined, ghost-like, spreading across the valley once more. The modern skyline ripples upon its surface, reflections mingling with the shadows of temples beneath. The water glows faintly with the colors of obsidian and fire. For a moment, time folds completely. The old city and the new exist together, one inhaling, the other exhaling. The narrator's voice becomes softer still, almost a prayer. Creation was never permanent. It was an act of faith renewed each dawn and each dusk, forgotten again. The Aztecs understood this. They built their world knowing it would drown, yet they built it anyway. To build in defiance of impermanence, that is what makes a civilization sacred. Rain begins to fall again, gentle this time. Each drop strikes the lake, sending ripples across the mirrored city. The music swells faintly, low strings, distant voices, the suggestion of a hymn. The words of the narrator return, steady, grounding. What ended was never the world itself, only our certainty of it. The gods did not vanish, they became memory. And memory, like water, always finds a way back. A final image. A single air bubble rises through the submerged ruins, gliding past columns and carvings until it breaks the surface into the night air. The light of the moon catches it for a breath, a perfect sphere of reflection, then it bursts, vanishing into silence. The narrator breathes one last time, voice barely audible. The city still breathes. Beneath every stone, beneath every footstep, the old heart beats on quiet, patient, eternal. The music fades into stillness. The screen darkens. And with the faint echo of water against stone, the final whisper returns not as an ending, but as a continuation of everything before it. Fade to silence, an echo beneath the surface.